What happens when a word loses its meaning, loses its worth, in the face of near impossible odds? What happens when it's a word that has defined nearly every aspect of your life? What about everything and everyone else associated with it, for and against? How much of its meaning are you willing to sacrifice to defend your home? Is it worth it? These questions and more form the heart of the story and narrative of Ghost of Tsushima. Released on July 17, 2020 for the PS4, then again on August 20th, 2021 for the PS5, it's a game whose narrative received widespread praise, both in the West and in Japan, buoyed by a stellar cast of characters, a vibrant and beautiful open world, and phenomenal cinematography and musical score, set against the grisly destruction and violence of the Mongol invasion of Japan in 1274. It's a classic tale of honor, revenge, kinship, and sacrifice, yet from this supposed simplicity, Sucker Punch Productions have weaved together a compelling and emotional journey, where the manner of one's honor and their place in a society built around it when beset by crushing circumstances is openly explored. It's a story that, along with the world in which it's set, is a work of art, a homage to the rich history of Japan and the island of Tsushima, as well as the legends of samurai cinema, namely the late great Akira Kurosawa, from whose work Sucker Punch was greatly inspired when conceptualizing the story and its themes. It's a testament to Sucker Punch's ability as storytellers in the video game medium, one that's even more impressive when you consider the year of its initial release, where it went head-to-head with uber-hyped juggernaut releases and still managed to stand on its own even to this day. However, as with anything, it's a story that's far from perfect, with a plethora of issues both in its writing and presentation that will hopefully be rectified in the rumored sequel. Such will be the subject matter of this video, where we will analyze Ghost's story from start to finish, as well as analyze and dissect its major themes and concepts. As is standard fare on this channel, I will only speak on gameplay when and where it's applicable, appropriate, or unavoidable as it pertains to the story. A few things to go over before we get started. For this video, I played through the game twice, first on a brand new run, then on a new game plus run where I mainlined the main story, then side quests afterwards. As such, you may see an interchange of armor and cosmetics in similar scenes. I will also not be speaking on the Iki Island DLC since its main story is only 5 odd hours, give or take, though I will refer to it from time to time and use scenes from it on occasion. That said, if you'd like to see a video on the DLC, let me know in the comments. Also, as Japanese is not my first language, there's a good chance that I will absolutely butcher the pronunciation of some Japanese names and locations, though I will make every effort not to, and I deeply apologize if I offend anyone in that regard. Last but not least, spoiler warning for all of Ghost of Tsushima's main story, some side quests, as well as portions of the Iki Island DLC. There will also be scenes and images that may be disturbing and distressing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, without further ado, let us dive into the world of 13th century medieval Japan and follow the tale of Jin Sakai and his struggle against the Mongols and with his own identity. Before we properly dive in, we need to have a brief history lesson. In 1274, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, under the rule of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, launched the first of 2 invasions of Japan, then under the rule of the Kamakura shogunate. This was done in response to Kublai's failed demands of Japan to become a Yuan vassal and tributary. As part of the first invasion, Kublai planned for his forces, which consisted of Mongols, Han Chinese, Jurchens, and Koreans, to seize the islands of Tsushima and Iki before landing on mainland Japan at Akata Bay, located in modern-day Fukuoka, with the invasion of Tsushima set to take place at Komoda Beach. It's at Komoda Beach that Ghost kicks things off, with the arrival of Lord Shimura and our main protagonist, Jin Sakai, who gives a very succinct, very stoic overview of the situation. The Mongols are here, and they mean business. In his overview, Jin makes no illusions about their chances at stopping the Mongols, sitting at slim to none, punctuated by the fact that there are only 80 samurai to defend Tsushima from the invasion. Now you may be thinking that number is pretty low, a number fabricated by Sucker Punch to give even more weight to an already frankly serious situation, but to my surprise, that was indeed the number of samurai present on Tsushima in 1274. This is according to the Soshi Kafu, a history of Tsushima's then rulers, the So clan, and serves as our main Japanese source of the actual historical invasion of Tsushima, and states rather clearly that there were only 80 samurai along with their retinue. By comparison, they faced a Mongol force numbering 8,000 men in 900 ships. As one might expect, the fighting at Komoda Beach didn't last long despite a spirited Japanese defense, and things go pretty much the same way in the game as well. Along with Jin, we're introduced to the aforementioned Lord Shimura, Jito, or Governor of Tsushima, as well as Jin's uncle. He gives a speech to Tsushima's defenders, listing off the key tenets of what it means to be samurai: tradition, courage, and honor. He then instructs Lord Harinobu Adachi to treat with the Mongols, to break their spirits. It's at this point, while Lord Adachi rides down the hill towards the beach, that, after nearly a minute and a half since starting the game, we finally get a glimpse of the Mongol invasion and the impossible task that Jin and his fellow samurai have before them. A simple shot, but one that makes abundantly clear the power the Mongols under Kublai wielded at that time. At the beach, Lord Adachi approaches the Mongols and demands that they send their finest warrior to face him. It's here that we're introduced to our main villain, Khotan Khan. More on him later, for his arrival is where things really begin to kick off, starting with him splashing some oil on Lord Adachi, then setting him on fire, before, after he's left to slow roast in his armor for a bit, promptly cutting his head off. The Mongols could care less about the samurai's code of honor. They're here to conquer, the how being inconsequential, though certainly not by samurai rules. Naturally, the samurai are shocked by this. Japan at this time, while not isolated from the rest of East Asia, hadn't fought a foreign enemy before, having exclusively fought amongst themselves, most notably during the Genpei Wars, which brought the reigning Kamakura shogunate to power. As a result, Japanese forces were totally inexperienced with non-Japanese tactics and thus were utterly baffled by the manner in which the Mongols and their allies waged war. This confrontation, if you can call it that, between Lord Adachi and Khotan Khan may be a reference to a passage found in the Japanese Hachimangu Dokkan, which describes how, during the First Battle of Akata Bay, the Japanese sent out a warrior to offer a challenge of single combat to anyone who dared, only to be met with what can be described as indifference from the Mongols, who instead just got on with it and promptly defeated the Japanese. Khotan Khan displays this promptness in his adept beheading of Lord Adachi, before asking, almost as if nothing just happened, if the samurai wished to surrender.
Samurai! Do you surrender?
Lord Shimura, seeing the samurai code proverbially spat on, doesn't take kindly to this request, and orders a headlong charge down the hill, kickstarting the Battle of Komoda Beach. It's at this moment we take control of Jin, galloping down the hill, then along the beach, cutting down Mongols as we go, before being promptly unhorsed by Mongol artillery. We then cut to Jin being saved by Shimura, before following him further along the beach, with the aim of finding and killing Khotan Khan, hopefully ending the invasion then and there. This plan, which was already precarious from the get-go, goes pretty much tits up when, after a brief engagement with the Mongols, only Jin and Shimura are left. Nevertheless, they press on, eventually catching sight of Khotan Khan and resolve to take him down. Let's see how that goes, shall we?
We end this together.
When we come back, we find Jin barely alive, with an arrow in his back, before spotting Shimura being taken prisoner by the Mongols. Jin will attempt to rescue him, but another arrow in the back puts paid to that plan. We're then granted a proper introduction to Khotan Khan as he treats with a bound Shimura, introducing himself as a cousin of Kublai, grandson of Genghis. What I'm sure about in this line is whether he's referring to himself as a grandson of Genghis or to Kublai, who most certainly was. In any event, now would be a perfect moment to make one thing abundantly clear at this early stage. Almost none of the characters in this story are historical, they are all wholly created by Sucker Punch. In fact, the only historical figures in this game don't even appear. Kublai Khan, because he didn't lead the invasion directly, the unnamed Emperor and Shogun of Japan, Emperor Go-Yuda and Prince Koreyasu respectively, for they would be back on mainland Japan, and Genghis Khan, because he's long dead. In fact, it's not even really fair to mention him since he's only mentioned once in this early scene with Khotan. By extension, none of the samurai clans that will be mentioned in this video are historical either. As mentioned earlier, Tsushima at this time was ruled by the So clan, given the post by the Kamakura shogunate, and as of this writing, I've been unable to identify any others. Insofar as I've been able to research, Sucker Punch considered including historical figures, but chose not to after being told by experts that it would be insensitive to do so, though I haven't been able to find out why that would be the case. Ultimately, I think it was a wise decision in the end, as it allowed the writers to tell the story they wanted to tell without being so constrained or weighed down by historical figures, especially when you consider the larger-than-life status that Genghis and Kublai have even to this day. Khotan once again asks Shimura if he'll surrender, in a scene that still gives me chills. Shimura responds by giving him the silent treatment, which results in his presumptive execution by Khotan. We then cut to Jin, face down in the sand, somehow still alive, before we get another cut, this time finding Jin without his armor and weapons, bandaged and in some cave, awoken by the sounds of Mongols in a nearby village. Entering the village, we find the Mongols doing what the Mongols do best, raiding and pillaging. Without our weapons, all we can do is sneak around and find the person responsible for saving us, Jin reckoning that they'll also have his sword. Entering home, we find our armor, broken but still usable, but no sword. Before we can move on, we're ushered back inside by a woman. Before proper introductions can be made, the woman instructs Jin to hide when a Mongol approaches the home and barges in. The woman, after putting on an act for the Mongol, promptly kills him, before telling Jin to follow her if he wants his sword back. The woman's name is Yuna, a resident of Komoda town which we're sneaking through right now, and the one who saved Jin back on the beach. From her, as we sneak around, we learn about what happened in the time since the battle. In short, the Mongols have captured half the island, and Lord Shimura somehow survived this, with him now being held prisoner at Castle Kaneda further east. Jin naturally wants to go save him, as Shimura, being the Jito, can rally what remains of Tsushima's forces to fight back and call for reinforcements from the mainland. For that, we need to find his sword, which Yuna took and traded for food and medicine. Coupled with the fact that she scavenges battlefields and clambers over rooftops, it doesn't take long for Jin to figure out that she's a thief, a particular plot point that will come back numerous times over the course of the story. We eventually reach the house of the sword's buyer, only to find him killed, meaning we'll have to look for it ourselves. When we find the sword, we're taken to a flashback of when Jin was a child, learning the way of the samurai from Shimura, in a sequence that serves as the game's combat tutorial. We'll discuss the narrative implications of this scene, plus a few others, a little later, but for now, all I'll say is that I'm of two minds about them. On the one hand, I'm not a fan. Flashback sequences in games for me often feel forced and slow down the pacing too much, even if they provide valuable context and backstory, and Ghost of Tsushima is no different. Conversely, I do like how a few of them are implemented and presented. After all, it wouldn't make sense for adult Jin to have to go through a grueling and frankly overlong training section when he's already an accomplished warrior, and so doing just that when he's a child makes much more sense narratively, which is why the initial fight on the beach is such a walk in the park gameplay-wise. After the flashback, we return to the present, where we're confronted by a Mongol, whom we easily dispatch. It's at this point that Yuna finds us and leads us towards some nearby stables, along the path to which we fight more Mongols and learn how to deal with multiple enemies at once. It's also along the way, after we save a man and his child, that we learn the real reason Yuna saved Jin. Her brother has been taken by the Mongols, and she needs Jin to get him back. Jin agrees to do so after he saves Lord Shimura, with Yuna offering her aid to this end. After selecting our color of haunts and giving it a name, we set off from Komoda and make for Castle Kaneda. Arriving, Jin marches towards the castle, bold as brass, before challenging the Mongols, introducing us to the standoff mechanic, a feature that I absolutely adore and gets better with upgrades, both to the mechanic itself and as Jin levels up and builds his legend. After this initial standoff, we, with Yuna's help, move through the lower section of the castle, slaughtering Mongols as we go, all while coming under fire from a Mongol artillery weapon of Korean origin called a hwacha, which is really weird because they don't technically exist. Yet. We'll discuss them and other historical inaccuracies and liberties later because for right now, they're fairly inconsequential to the broader picture. After a while, Jin will tell Yuna to fall back and keep the road behind him clear after she expresses her misgivings about this attack, before proceeding on his own towards the bridge that leads towards the heart of Kaneda. It's on this bridge, after slaying a few more Mongols, that Jin challenges Khotan, one the Khan readily answers.
Khotan Khan!
Khotan will exposit for a bit, even bringing Shimura out, confirming that he is indeed alive and well, all things considered, before the two men proceed to duel upon the bridge. There's no defeating the Khan here. Even if you manage to deal some hefty damage of your own and are methodical in your approach, Khotan deals too much damage on his own and you'll quickly use up all your resolve, the means by which to heal yourself and, at this early stage in the game, can only be refilled by killing enemies. Eventually, he'll knock our health down to 0, but instead of finishing a battered Jin off, he again extends an offer of surrender, knowing that Shimura is watching from the battlements. In response, Jin slashes him across the face, which unsurprisingly enrages the Khan, who gets a hold of him and throws him off the bridge. We jump to another flashback. Here we're introduced to Jin's father, Kazumasa Sakai, who's quickly put to the sword by a bandit while Jin cowers in a nearby hut. We then jump forward in time to the Sakai estate in the village of Omi, where we follow young Jin as we head to his father's funeral. The relationship between Jin and his father won't be further explored until much later in the story and the events surrounding Kazumasa's death in the Iki Island DLC. Instead, it's in this scene that we see where the first bonds between Jin and Shimura are forged in light of Kazumasa's death, with Shimura taking Jin on as his ward, and that Jin feels immense guilt over his father's passing, blaming himself for what happened, a guilt that persists into adulthood. We then jump back to the present, where we find Jin having miraculously survived his fall. As he falls to his knees and wonders aloud just how on earth he's going to save his uncle now, a conspicuous wind blows in from the water. Resolving to follow the wind, we clamber up the hill inland and manage to run into Yuna arguing with the horses. This is our introduction to the guiding wind, the means by which we can find things across Tsushima, be they locations or quest objectives. You'll notice once you're released into the open world that Ghost has almost no heads-up display. Your health bar and resolve meter will only show up in combat or when you take any sort of damage, and any other menus, such as for switching secondary weapons, distractions, or stances, will only appear when prompted. There's also no mini-map or compass, and quest markers will only appear on screen when you're close to whatever it is you're looking for, again be it a location or quest objective. With that in mind, how do you know where to go? Well, you could just run around like an idiot until you somehow manage to find what you're looking for, or you can call upon the guiding wind, which will blow in the direction of where you need or want to go. It's an absolutely brilliant mechanic and design choice, one that greatly aids the cinematic feel the game has from start to finish, eliminating the need to be constantly checking a map or compass for directions. On top of that, it's very easy to use. All you have to do is swipe up on the touchpad whenever you wish. If I have one very minor criticism, and I grant this is entirely personal, is that the guiding wind doesn't take into account geography. You could be looking over the edge of a very, very high cliff or up the face of a mountain, and the guiding wind will insist that you can go through or over it. Again, a very minor, very personal criticism, but one that can get quite annoying at times. Jin and Yuna begin planning their next move, Jin reasoning that they need to think outside the box. Koten has clearly done his homework. Fighting him the samurai way, at least initially, isn't going to cut it. They have to surprise him, subvert his expectations. For that, they'll need allies, including Yuna's brother Taka, whom Yuna calls the best blacksmith in all of Tsushima. To that end, the two split up, Yuna heading off to find out where the Mongols are holding Taka, while Jin sets off on his own. We're then treated to a picturesque scene of Jin riding through fields of pampas grass in a forest, where we're treated to the title screen and the start of Act 1. Act 1 is where the world of Tsushima finally opens up for us and we're free to go in whichever direction we please, though for now we're restricted to the southern region of Izuhara. We also have a couple of options story-wise that we can follow. We can either head straight to Yuna and help look for information on the whereabouts of her brother, or look for Sensei Ishikawa, a renowned archer who was absent from the Battle of Komada Beach. After completing these two, we can then obtain help from Lady Masako Adachi, wife of the late Lord Harunobu Adachi, and Ryuzo, an old friend of Jin and a Ronin, or masterless samurai, who leads a group of them called the Straw Hats. On the face of it, Act 1 can be summarized simply as the gathering of allies to retake Castle Kaneda and rescue Lord Shimura from Mongol captivity. Yet recruiting the aid of these individuals, as one might expect, isn't as simple as walking up to them and asking very nicely over a cup of tea. Each of them will have a particular need or problem that must be resolved before they can or will help. In this, underneath the oversimplified crux of it all, Act 1 serves as the means to lay the groundwork for future events in the story and side quests, the latter in the case of Ishikawa, Masako, and even Yuna to a degree. It's in these recruitment quests where the main story's themes and concepts begin to take shape, and characters' personal stakes begin to form and evolve, while also slowly introducing us to additional gameplay features and mechanics. Yuna, as we already know, to save Taka and help create something for Jin to scale the walls of Canada. It starts when we reunite with her at a farmstead, where she learns that the Mongols were escorting prisoners at a nearby camp. At the camp, we rescue an imprisoned Ronin who mentions that more captives were being moved to a town called Azamo Bay further south, and that a blacksmith was among them. It's also from him that we learn of the whereabouts of the Straw Hat Ronin. It's also in the camp that we're treated to another flashback from Jin's youth after he stealthily kills a Mongol for the first time and makes an absolute meal of it. In the flashback, while hunting with Lord Shimura, we see an assassin from Yarikawa attempt to kill Shimura, but fail horribly. It's during this flashback that Shimura teaches young Jin to always look his enemy in the eye when he kills them, to do so with honor and without anger or fear. A lesson that he's just thrown out the window. When we meet up with Yuna again after this, we find her in the company of Kenji, a swindler and sake brewer. Kenji, put plainly, is the game's comic relief, and a much needed one at that. For without him, the game would be extremely humorless otherwise, but he does it with an admirable amount of restraint, remaining within the bounds of his established character. Kenji has been selling his sake to the Mongols in his bid to stay alive. At Jin's consternation at him doing business with the enemy, he says,
"I keep the Mongols drunk, and they let me keep my head."
In doing so, Kenji makes regular deliveries to Azamo Bay, granting him unique access to the town, which is a fortress and would require an army to get in otherwise. Jin and Yuna take advantage of this and sneak into Azamo Bay during one of these deliveries, hiding on his cart until they're within the town walls. Once inside, we follow the trail of the Mongol in charge, clambering over rooftops, most of the time, while making sure not to raise the alarm. We eventually find Taka just as he's about to be executed before Yuna jumps in and puts the slaver to the sword. The trio then hasten to make their escape, jumping the walls and making for a crossroads where Kenji is waiting for them, avoiding Mongol patrols all the while. During our escape, we quickly learn that Taka, who is the younger of the two, is nothing like big sister Yuna, lacking her courage and resolve, which, in this moment, is currently amplified due to his mistreatment by the Mongols and because he was within a hair's breadth of losing his head. He makes up for this, as we'll see throughout the story, with great kindness and gentleness, as well as being a master blacksmith, though the former can give way to a sort of naivety, which at times is sharply rebuked by the much-hardened Yuna, the dynamic of their relationship being unpacked in greater detail later on. We find Kenji with the horses, and the group hasten to generate some distance between themselves and Azamo Bay, a ride that takes them to the top of a hill overlooking much of Izuhara. As repayment for freeing him, Taka vows to make something that will get Jin over the walls of Castle Canada. For that, they need a forge, and there just so happens to be a place in Izuhara, at a town called Komatsu. When we're ready, we can head to Komatsu and oh look, Mongols everywhere. Most of the townsfolk have either been captured or killed, with the remainder hiding in and around the forge itself. Now the Mongols are planning to return to finish those who are left, with the ones we face initially just being scouts. Jin and Yuna resolve to hold the town while Taka gets the forge started, but before that we need to do a couple of things. Namely, find and rescue Yukio, Taka's assistant, then rescue Yukio's wife and sister-in-law, then help Yuna rescue another family across the river. With all that out of the way, it's time to make our stand. While Taka works inside, Jin and Yuna will defend the forge from waves of Mongols, who will send a whole panoply of enemies against you, including dogs. Eventually we defeat the Mongols and retreat to a cutscene, where Taka and the others look at Jin with shock and surprise. Never before had they seen a samurai fight the way he did, using all manner of tricks, including those supposedly unbecoming of a samurai. Jin will naturally brush it off, but Yuna will take advantage and play it up, making Jin out to be a vengeful spirit back from among the dead of Komada to slaughter the Mongols. So is born the legend of the ghost, one that surely won't spiral out of Jin's control. Right? After some time passes and a brief check-in with Koten and Shimura, the former vainly attempting to sway the latter to join the Mongol Empire, we receive our gift from Taka, a grappling hook called a Kaginawa, which I was surprised to find in my research actually saw regular use among samurai and regular foot soldiers in feudal Japan, particularly during sieges, as well as by the more clandestine ninja. After receiving our grappling hook, we receive an impromptu visit from Ryuzo. Wait, hang on a minute. We haven't even properly met him yet. What's he doing here? Okay, so in my attempt to keep things in relative order, I may have neglected to mention that you'll need to complete a few other main story quests before the quest to retake Komatsu Forge. Okay, there's only one, and that's recruiting Sensei Ishikawa's help, but I would strongly recommend recruiting Yuzo and Lady Masako first when their quests are available before going to Komatsu anyways, since I find the story flows a lot better when done in the order that I show. So, with that in mind, let's start with Ishikawa and Masako's, since recruiting them is fairly straightforward in that they only require completing a single quest, whereas Ryuzo's requires completing 2, 3 if you include the one that follows right after getting the grappling hook from Taka. The search for Sensei Ishikawa begins at the town of Hiyoshi Springs, where he has his dojo, which we find at the top of a cliff overlooking the town after a local leads us to the foot of it. While speaking to the local, we learn that Ishikawa is a samurai archer of legendary status, with just as legendary stories to go along with it, having previously served Clan Nagao, but he mysteriously left Nagao's service, choosing to live a life of seclusion for reasons only known to him. He had meant to be at Komoda Beach with the rest of the samurai, but failed to appear, a detail that is mentioned prior to the quest and during this initial phase when speaking to the local. This point becomes even more acute when we arrive at the dojo and find the remains of a fight, including a blood trail with Ishikawa conspicuously missing. We follow the blood trail to a nearby home where we're confronted by the sensei aiming an arrow at Jin in an abrupt and rather awkward transition. In fact, there's quite a few cutscenes that have this problem, if not most, highlighting a key issue with Ghost of Tsushima's narrative presentation. We'll circle back to that later. For now, we need to gain Ishikawa's help in rescuing Lord Shimura. As mentioned before, this won't be as simple as asking him nicely, for his student, another skilled archer, is missing and he can't help Jin until they're found. To that end, Jin offers his assistance, knowing 2 skilled archers are better than 1, and together we set off in search of them. Early on, we learn a bit about Ishikawa's student, a peasant woman named Tomoe. Jin expresses surprise at the fact that this student is a woman, though he really shouldn't be. Female warriors fighting alongside samurai, known as onamusha, were not uncommon in medieval Japan, with a few, namely Tomoe Gozen and Angaku Gozen, gaining an important place in Japanese literature. While most onamusha were versed with the naginata, there was also an emphasis on the use of ranged weapons, as an onamusha's primary purpose was to defend the household against bandits and other marauders. What is surprising is that Tomoe is a peasant. All onamusha belonged to the warrior class of feudal Japan, sharing this status with the samurai who, as one might expect, stood above the average peasantry in the social hierarchy. Being a samurai himself, it's surprising that Ishikawa would take on a peasant as his student when previously he exclusively taught other samurai. Ishikawa reasons that Tomoe is no mere peasant that just so happens to be handy with a bow, but a prodigy, capable of outshooting any samurai. After a run-in with some Mongols and receiving a half-bow as a gift from Ishikawa, we eventually track Tomoe to Fort Nakayama, with both Jin and the sensei reasoning that she's being held inside. After clearing the Mongols from the fort, we begin our search, starting with the grisly discovery of slaughtered civilians, tied up and shot with arrows, Tomoe's pendant found among the corpses. As we search the fort for any sign of Tomoe, we're slowly served up a twist as we come to realize that the Mongols freed Tomoe, gave her her own personal quarters, let her use her bow, and in return, she showed them Ishikawa's way of the bow, as evidenced by a scroll written in Japanese with Mongolian translations. Our search is interrupted as we hear calls for help and find a lone survivor, wounded and on the brink of death. From the survivor, we learn that Tomoe was caged with them, but that the Mongols freed her and gave her armor and a bow. Furthermore, the bodies we found were her doing, a gruesome means to prove her skill to the Mongols, who subsequently recruited her. Ishikawa storms off, mentioning that he should have killed her, then spills the beans when Jin demands answers, the sensei's comment having grabbed his attention. Put simply, it was Tomoe, not bandits, that attacked Ishikawa and kept him from reaching Komoda Beach. He remains rather guarded when asked why, only that he pushed her too hard, before flipping it back on her by saying that she doesn't know what it means to be samurai. Jin offers his aid in tracking down Tomoe, an offer Ishikawa accepts, both men agreeing that she can't be allowed to teach the Mongols his way of the bow, though not before a spot of tension arises between them, it being very clear to Jin that Ishikawa hasn't been entirely honest with him about his relationship with Tomoe, a tension that will often plague the relationship as we progress through the rest of Ishikawa's questline. From there, both men go their separate ways for now, Ishikawa promising to come to Jin's aid when it's time to rescue Lord Shimura, while also telling Jin to meet him at his dojo when he's ready to continue the search for Tomoe. He then also adds, at Jin's asking, to seek out Lady Masako in his bid for allies. With that said, let's go look for the matriarch of Clan Adachi. Assuming you begin right after recruiting Ishikawa, our search for Masako takes us south from Hiyoshi Springs, into a region of woodland known as the Golden Forest, where we find the Adachi estate, and where the family would have hunkered down while Lord Harinobu and his samurai went to Komoda Beach. Upon arriving, we find all is not well, the estate abandoned, with signs of battle scattered across the grounds, including lots of blood, with neither Masako or anyone from Clan Adachi anywhere to be found. Some bandits can be found though, bursting from one of the buildings as we approach. We promptly dispatch these bandits and continue our search, though I find it hilarious that, as he's literally splitting them open, Jin will demand to know where Masako is as if they're in any position to answer.
Where's Lady Masako? Tell me where she is!
Continuing our investigation takes us to the stables, where we find a set of horse tracks mixed with foot tracks leaving the estate, which we proceed to follow. Along the way, we find the remains of arrows and blood, and it doesn't take long for us to find the mount of our mysterious rider, felled by many arrows. Jin will investigate the horse, and it's here we're finally introduced to Lady Masako Adachi.
Dead for days. Lady Masako, it's me.
Two things about this scene. One, it's infinitely better than our introduction to Ishikawa, though not as good as Ryuzo's, which we'll see later. Two is that I both laugh and cringe at just how fucking deadpan Jin is when he addresses Masako for the first time.
Lady Masako, it's me.
I can confidently say now that Jin Sakai is one of my favorite characters in video games, but back when I played this game for the first time in 2020, for the first few hours at least, that was far from the case. In fact, his personality in these early stages very nearly drove me to drop the game entirely, since I wasn't keen on sticking with this drone of a human being for the next 20 to 25 hours of the main story, plus the many more hours of side content. What kept me from doing so was the supporting cast, including the main villain, Koten Khan, who, as we'll get into later, doesn't get enough love, I feel. I was also really enjoying the story itself, the excellent combat system, and the world of Tsushima and, at least in the beginning, its many side activities. Yet initially, this was all in spite of Jin, who, at the start, comes off as incredibly stiff and stifled, showing barely any emotion, being a man of few words, to the point that it got incredibly grating, this bit with Masako being perhaps the most ardent example.
Lady Masako, it's me.
Yet now, having played through the game a few times, soaking up its many stories, I wholly understand now that this stiffness was all intentional, a part of his samurai upbringing. You only need to think back on the flashbacks from when he was a child, training with Lord Shimura. In a striking contrast, young Jin is far more emotional and expressive than his adult self in these early hours. Subsequently, Lord Shimura will emphasize the importance of controlling one's emotions no matter the situation, including, as we see during the hunting scene after Jin makes his first stealth kill, when taking a life. We see this mindset set in stone when we first meet Jin, and remains so for the first few hours of the story before it begins to gradually break down, thanks in large part to the influence of Yuna. That's not to say Jin becomes overly emotional all the time, which would be just as bad as the opposite. He still very much maintains the self-discipline that permeates many of his actions, major or minor, it's just that we see a greater willingness to show emotion in certain scenes. Jin will ask for Clan Adachi's support in rescuing Lord Shimura, but to his shock and horror, Masako will answer that Clan Adachi is dead, slaughtered by their own people. This immediately explains the signs of battle and blood back at the estate, as well as the armed men we faced. As with Ishikawa, Jin offers Masako his support in searching for answers, and the two set off. As they ride, Masako will explain that they were attacked while her husband, Lord Harinobu, and the rest of the clan's men were at Komoda. While her sister Hana fled with her grandchildren, Masako stayed and fought the assassins alongside the wives of her two sons. Eventually they were overwhelmed, and at some point Masako was the only one left and forced to flee. Things only get worse when, in searching for them, she found her sister and grandchildren slaughtered on the road, including, and this is the bit that gets me every time, little Natsu, who was only just a newborn. We follow Masako to the Golden Temple, situated in the heart of the Golden Forest, and has been turned into a makeshift refuge for refugees fleeing the Mongol invasion. Masako wishes for us to seek out the monk Sogen and inform him of the fate of Clan Adachi while she waits on the opposite side of the temple. After speaking with the head monk Junshin, we find Sogen and inform him of what happened, who will then say, at Jin's asking, that he hasn't seen anyone out of the ordinary and that Masako is welcome to remain at the temple if she wishes. A normal, benign, perhaps even banal conversation. Right? After Sogen, we speak to the temple armorer who Masako had repairing some armor for her to be gifted to Jin. We then seek out Masako, who, as you might have already guessed, suspects Sogen's involvement in her family's massacre, the monk having visited the Adachi estate just before the assassins. With Masako, we begin to trail Sogen as he hurriedly leaves the temple, taking care to remain unseen. We eventually follow the monk to an old inn where we find more armed men, just like the ones we confronted back at the estate. Overhearing their conversation implicates Sogen and the armed men, and we swiftly move to take them down while Sogen hides in the inn. Once the assassins are taken care of, we head upstairs to confront Sogen, who remains frustratingly defiant, refusing to say who was behind the massacre. He eventually goes too far, and Masako butchers him on the spot.
Be removed.
They were children!
Masako!
Okay, so that's grand, but we still need more information. Thankfully, we find it in the form of a scroll bearing a list of names as well as a clan symbol, which I don't think we ever actually see. The symbol itself doesn't really matter in the long run, for it only suggests that a rival clan was behind the massacre. The list of names, however. What's revealed, not in this quest but over the course of Masako's questline, is that the names on the list are individuals who, for one reason or another, hold a long-standing grudge against Clan Adachi and Masako specifically, though the bigwig behind it remains a mystery until nearer the end. For now, Jin offers his support to Masako in exchange for her help in rescuing Lord Shimura, adding that he would want justice for Masako and Clan Adachi as much as anyone. At this, Masako agrees to help. Until such time, the two go their separate ways. Alright, 2 down, 1 more to go. It's time to find Ryuzo and the Straw Hats, the most involved questline in Act 1 outside of Yuna's. Now, saying that we have to find Ryuzo specifically is a bit of a misnomer, for at this juncture neither we nor Jin actually know that he's one of them. The objective itself is to find the Straw Hats alone, a search that begins in the Kishi grasslands at a burning cart with a Mongol corpse nearby. From the cart, we follow a trail of more Mongol corpses into a nearby forest. At a small glade, we find a lone straw hat, which triggers a cutscene.
Jin Sakai.
Ryuzo. You look like a scarecrow.
You've looked better too.
Jin will ask after the Straw Hat leader, to ask for aid in rescuing Lord Shimura, but Ryuzo will answer that he died on Komoda Beach. In fact, the Straw Hats are in shambles after the battle, hurting and starving, with Ryuzo now being their de facto leader. With that in mind, he isn't too keen on asking his comrades to risk their lives for one man. Jin will begin to negotiate, saying Shimura will pay Ryuzo and the Straw Hats whatever they want in return for their services once Tsushima is free, which, if I'm being honest, is a mighty big promise to make at such an early stage. Of course, it'll rightly be argued that Jin doesn't have much of a choice but to make such a weighty offer, since he desperately needs as many swords as he can get to rescue Shimura, but without a proper guarantee beyond his good word, and the fact that he and Ryuzo used to be close friends, he's risking his own reputation on the promise of something that may never materialize. At this early stage, there are still too many unknowns, including whether or not Lord Shimura would actually honor such a deal. Maybe he's got a hatred for the Straw Hats or just Ronin in general that Jin doesn't know about. After all, Ronin weren't viewed in the best of lights in feudal Japan due to their status as masterless samurai. According to Bushido, a samurai was expected to commit seppuku, also called harakiri, or ritual suicide, upon the loss of their master. A samurai who chose not to do so was, according to Bushido, on his own, becoming a Ronin and was meant to suffer great shame as a result. This in effect made them undesirable in feudal Japanese society, a prejudice and discrimination imposed by other samurai and daimyo, the Japanese equivalent of a medieval European lord. This is why I say that Jin's taking a risk and supposing Lord Shimura will pay Ryuzo and the Straw Hats whatever they want for helping free Tsushima. Shimura's whole life revolves around the samurai code, and so it wouldn't be impossible to believe that he would view men like Ryuzo as being the antithesis of this, and thus view him and his comrades with sharp disdain. Ryuzo suggests that his men may be interested, but before either of them can continue negotiating, more Mongols show up, with Ryuzo quickly adding that he'll think about it. After the Mongols are dealt with, Ryuzo will state that the Straw Hats can't save Shimura, for they're starving and, at the rate things are going, they won't survive the week. It's why Ryuzo was out in the wilderness in the first place, hunting for food. Now he's returning empty-handed. Jin offers to return to camp with Ryuzo, where they can work on fixing the Straw Hats' food problem. Ryuzo acquiesces, and the two set off. Along the way, we learn a bit more about their relationship. Previously, they had been fast friends, but after Jin beat Ryuzo in a duel during a tournament a few years prior, the two of them went their separate ways. Jin went back to Sakai lands, and Ryuzo joined the Straw Hats. As we'll learn later, Ryuzo harbors some resentment over how the duel went down. Ryuzo wasn't born into a samurai clan, but being friends with the head of one in Jin meant that many other clan leaders saw their duel, Ryuzo hoping that, by winning, one of them would raise him up to become one. In losing to Jin, who beat him with incredible ferocity, he lost that chance to do so and thus was left with the only other choice available to him, to become a Ronin and join the Straw Hats. It's a resentment that will become a point of contention later on, so make a mental note of it for now. Arriving at the Straw Hat camp, Ryuzo gathers his men and Jin informs them that they have a plan. On the way back, we come across a peasant whose wagon was raided by the Mongols, who took all his food to Fort Ohira. Jin proposes that they raid Fort Ohira and simply take back the food. The Mongols will be deprived of valuable resources, the Straw Hats won't starve, and by extension they can help Jin rescue Lord Shimura. The plan is met with almost immediate skepticism by the Ronin. While it's a plan, it's an incredibly half-baked one at best. The Straw Hats are in a weak position, almost too weak to take on the Mongols, and Jin just threw it at them without working out the finer details ahead of time, as Ryuzo's quick to point out. Alternatively, Ryuzo takes slight umbrage at Jin's apparent taking charge of the situation when he's the Straw Hat's leader, a fact he conspicuously points out to Jin after he gives him a set of Straw Hat gear and agrees to help him rescue Lord Shimura after they get their food. Sometime later, we reunite with Ryuzo and the Straw Hats at Takusudama Cemetery, overlooking Fort Ohira, as well as a nearby lighthouse serving as an alarm and another Mongol camp on the shores of an inlet, with a trio of Mongol ships just offshore. Jin will sneak into the fort first and take out the alarm, then aid Ryuzo and his men in taking the fort itself. The fort quickly falls and everything looks hunky-dory, until they realize that there isn't any food in the fort. Ryuzo finds some Mongol orders written in Chinese, which Jin partly understands, having been made to read Sun Tzu as part of his education in his youth. A neat touch of authenticity since Kublai's Mongol Yuan dynasty was mostly based in China as well as Mongolia, and the historical invasion force, as mentioned earlier, contained a sizable contingent of Han Chinese. According to the orders, Fort Ohira was only a temporary depot. Everything since has been taken to the ships offshore. Great, what the hell now? Jin's not about to give up, and with Ryuzo we begin to scan the Mongol camp below to see how we can get to the ships. Jin and Ryuzo plan to go it alone, while the rest of the Straw Hats rain arrows down from the cliffs above, giving them the cover they need to grab a boat and head for the Mongol ships. We do just that and manage to sneak aboard one of the ships and begin our search for food. The first ship yields nothing, so we fight our way to the other two ships, with Jin and Ryuzo each searching one of them once our Mongol assailants have been dealt with. With Jin, we don't find any food, but we do find a scroll containing orders, command assignments, and a map with supply routes. Interesting. We return to Ryuzo's ship, where we finally find all the food the Mongols have taken, as well as Ryuzo in a bit of a pickle. After we pull him out of said pickle, Mongols from another ship that seem to appear from out of nowhere rain fire arrows down on the ship, forcing Jin and Ryuzo to abandon ship and leave the food behind. Back on shore, Jin will show a discouraged Ryuzo the scroll he found containing the map and supply routes, presenting it as an alternative to all the food they lost back on the ship. Ryuzo wants the scroll for himself, but Jin's reluctant, stating that he wants to continue working together. I find Jin's reluctance to hand over the scroll a bit strange, not because he is, but because I'm not entirely sure how to interpret it. Is he reluctant because he genuinely wants to continue working with Ryuzo, or is it because he doesn't trust the Straw Hats to keep their word and help him rescue Lord Shimura without his personal intervention? A lack of trust wouldn't be surprising if we bring in the aforementioned prejudice samurai have for Ronin. Maybe deep down, Jin isn't all that fond of Ronin himself. It's even intimated early on when we first meet Ryuzo that he doesn't think highly of the Straw Hats to begin with. This would, however, stand in contention with his apparent attempts to rekindle his old friendship with Ryuzo, which the latter has more or less gently rebuffed, and regret over how things played out at the tournament years earlier when Ryuzo gives his side of the equation. It could also simply be just that Jin feels himself responsible for the Straw Hats' well-being, given what he's asking them to do, as well as making sure his friend maintains their loyalty and wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with them to the end, as a symbol of his promise, both current and future. Either way, Ryuzo isn't giving in, stating plainly that he needs the scroll, perhaps suggesting that his continued leadership of the Straw Hats is dependent on it. Jin relents and lets him take it, on the condition that he and his men be there for him at Castle Kaneda when the time comes. So ends the tale of Ryuzo. Sort of. Let's fast forward back to Komatsu Forge, to just after we receive our grappling hook from Taka and Ryuzo appears, frantically calling for Jin. So, in the intervening time since we gave him that scroll, rescuing Taka, getting Komatsu Forge up and running, a sizable portion of the Straw Hats got captured by the Mongols while raiding food stores and are currently being held at Fort Yatate. Obviously, without men, we stand little chance of rescuing Lord Shimura, never mind the fact the Mongols are likely to take their heads. With that in mind, we need to rescue them, and we set off with Ryuzo to Fort Yatate, linking up with some of his men along the way. The fort itself is situated on a plateau with sheer cliffs nearly all the way around it, and only one way in and out, one that is bound to be heavily guarded. Jin reckons that the Mongols won't be watching the cliffs at the rear, and so decides to sneak in that way. From there, we'll free the Straw Hat prisoners and take down the Mongols, while signaling Ryuzo and his riders to charge in, catching the Mongol garrison in a pincer. From here, we split up with Ryuzo and begin to climb, making ample use of our new grappling hook. As you might have already guessed, this whole quest, while important to the story, largely serves as a means of introducing the player to the hook, as well as where and how it can be used. Eventually we make it inside the fort, where we hear the captured Straw Hats singing. It's by hearing them sing that Ryuzo knew that they were still alive, though both he and Jin remarked that it seemed strange for the Mongols to allow it. In any event, we free the captives, signal Ryuzo, then join him in slaughtering the garrison, or at least what's left after we've had our turn with some of them. The remaining Mongols, caught in the pincer, are swiftly dispatched, and we can begin celebrating a resoundingly successful rescue. Except something's amiss. Once the fight's over, Jin will speak with Ryuzo, who learns from the captives that the Mongols didn't hurt them. In fact, they even fed them. Good food as well, which explains all the singing. Why bother?
Maybe they expected something in return.
I'm sure it's nothing. With Ryuzo's men rescued, everything is now in place to rescue Lord Shimura. After meeting with Yuna in Komatsu Forge, we jump forward a day to Castle Kaneda, where we see Koten Khan inform Shimura, after a brief conversation, that he's leaving Kaneda to head north to Castle Shimura, Lord Shimura's home. We then jump forward again by a few hours to the dead of night. All of our allies have gathered, except for Ryuzo and the Straw Hats. With no time to lose, we forge on ahead without them, speaking with Yuna when we're ready, as well as with our other allies beforehand if we so choose. Jin will gather everyone together and go over the plan. We'll start by infiltrating the castle and taking down the alarm, after which everyone else will storm in through the main gate. Once all together, everyone will head for the main keep where Lord Shimura is being held, get him out, then hightail it and escape. It's a plan that entirely hinges on stealth. Should the Mongols catch a whiff of them before the alarm is taken down, they may execute Shimura before they can reach him. Not very samurai-esque, but what choice do they have? We begin by scaling the cliffs, before getting inside and carefully taking out Mongols nearby the alarms, which consist of early gunpowder tubes. Once that's done, everyone convenes once more, where Jin hands out assignments before moving on to the upper courtyard, joined by Masako. The upper courtyard is where the Hwacha from the Prologue is located, which will need to be neutralized before they can continue, to ensure an unhindered exit. We can do this either by stealth or head-on, though in my experience, the stealth approach always seems to devolve into the head-on one. In any event, the upper courtyard is cleared, and Jin leaves Masako behind to operate the Hwacha so as to cover their escape, before joining Yuna further along near the bridge to the heart of the castle. Like the upper courtyard, the approach to the bridge is crawling with Mongols, and like before, we can either stealth it or go in guns blazing, though that said, like before, stealth often devolves into brutal melee, especially if you're a goddamn idiot like me. Once the way is clear, we proceed across the bridge. Naturally, the gate at the end is locked, necessitating we find another way around. We do this, grappling around the cliffs, then open the gate and let Yuna in, before proceeding to take down every Mongol in our path. The way to the main keep is also blocked by a gate. Telling Yuna to hold the area behind him, Jin proceeds to go alone, and we clamber through a handy opening in the wall where we find Ryuzo? Look, I'm just going to dispense with the suspenseful build-up and say it plain, though you, as well as I, may have already seen this coming a mile away. Ryuzo's betrayed Jin, and the Straw Hats have joined the Mongols. The why is twofold, though only one layer is stated directly, while the other, while in my opinion plainly obvious, is only hinted at. Koten Khan has put a bounty on the ghost's head, meaning Jin. By now, Jin's actions across Izuhara has earned him a fearsome reputation, the ghost sobriquet given to him by Yuna Bakakomatsu only gaining more traction, despite his efforts to quash it. Koten will even bring it up with Shimura in one of the scenes where we see them conversing. Anyone can claim this bounty, and Ryuzo, thinking of his men who continue to starve, has taken up this offer, while his men have joined up with Koten's main force as it marches north towards Castle Shimura. The second layer to Ryuzo's betrayal revolves around the personal history and subsequent tension between him and Jin, which has slowly been building to this moment since their reunion. Throughout their time together, you can feel the simmering resentment Ryuzo has for Jin, fueled by the latter's victory over the former in their duel, which cost Ryuzo his chance of becoming a samurai. This takes form initially in his reluctance to help Jin, before blossoming with Koten's bounty. This is further compounded by the fact that Jin was asking him to risk his men's lives to rescue Lord Shimura, a man who sent them to their deaths when the Mongols first arrived. A big reason why the Straw Hats were in dire straits when we first find them is due to them being decimated by the Mongols at Komoda Beach, when they were sent into the meat grinder on Shimura's orders. As one might expect, Ryuzo isn't too fond of the idea of fighting for a man who so easily sent him and his comrades to their deaths and would probably do it again. A man who just so happens to be the uncle of the man who kept him from becoming a samurai and rising up feudal Japan's rigid societal ladder. This has all now come to a head in a pond in the shadow of Castle Kaneda's main keep, illuminated by a full moon and the many floating lanterns in what is perhaps the most picturesque setting for a duel across the entire game, with maybe one exception. Outside of its setting, the duel with Ryuzo isn't really anything to write home about, apart from serving as an introduction to fighting samurai. Act 2 will see the introduction of Straw Hat Ronin as incounterable enemies across Toyotama, the region just north of Castle Kaneda, in Mongol outposts, in side quests, and out in the open world. This duel with Ryuzo serves as something akin to a teaching seminar on how to fight them, and you may find yourself on the back foot, at least initially, as you try to gauge their style. I say theirs because they all fight the same. Even more scripted scenarios offer just slightly different variations of the same style, which isn't criticism, the Mongols and their variants are the same way. In any event, we defeat Ryuzo, but instead of killing him and saving himself a whole heap of trouble later, Jin offers Ryuzo a chance to redeem himself and join in saving Tsushima from the Mongols. Instead, Ryuzo essentially tells him to shove it and alerts the remaining Mongols of Jin's presence before scurrying off, nursing his wounds. With that done, all there's left to do is get inside the main keep and rescue Shimura, slaughtering any Mongols that stand in our way. The main keep is much the same, taking down Mongols as we make for the top, where we find Shimura kneeling and bound. We take down his guard and free him before proceeding outside to take down the remaining Mongol garrison just as dawn breaks. We're eventually joined by the rest of the gang, who aid us in taking down Mongol reinforcements before we can finally rest and relax. Castle Kaneda has been taken and Lord Shimura freed, so truly begins the liberation of Tsushima. But before we move on to the next act, let's check in on a certain someone. To do that, we jump forward by 2 days to Castle Shimura, where Mongol forces have laid siege. Naturally, the defenders are refusing to open the gates to Khoten, who has prisoners tied up to stakes just in front of the walls. Ryuzo's here as well, about to remind Khoten of their deal when the Khan says this.
When men earn it.
I don't think it takes a genius to figure out what he means. Ryuzo is hesitant, as any sane person would be, but with his men still starving and the Khan giving no other option, he takes the torch and sets fire to one of the prisoners, before pleading for the gates to be opened so as to spare the other prisoners the same fate. Thankfully, the defenders do just that, opening the way for Khoten to stroll inside, while Ryuzo falls to his knees in anguish, bringing Act 1 to a close. Act 2 doesn't immediately start with the recapture of Castle Kaneda. After we see Ryuzo's act and Khoten stroll through the gates of Castle Shimura, we cut back to Castle Kaneda, where we find Jin by the same pond where he and Ryuzo dueled when Yuna finds him. Jin's thoughts are rankled by Ryuzo's betrayal before turning to Yuna, for he expected her to be long gone by now. An element of Yuna's deal with Jin in rescuing Shimura is that she would attain safe passage to the mainland for her and Taka, for there's nothing left for them on Tsushima save for never-ending hardship. It's a plot point that comes up repeatedly across Acts 1 and 2. With that in mind, it comes as a bit of a surprise to see that Yuna and Taka are still hanging around, with even Yuna being surprised. We'll get into the why in a short bit, for first we need to meet with Lord Shimura, who's been looking for Jin in the castle's main keep. Shimura will inform Jin that he's heard all about his activities across Izuhara, including those involving what he considers to be less than honorable, at least according to the samurai code. We see this in the cutscene showcasing Shimura conversing with Khoten while he was a prisoner, where the Khan at first attempts to sway Shimura over to his side, then to informing Shimura of his nephew's exploits, with the clear intent of driving a wedge between them. Naturally, Shimura isn't pleased about what he's heard, but understands that Jin was only doing what he had to do, but makes clear that, from now on, they'll have to do things the proper way, like samurai. Jin will then ask after Yuna and their deal, to which Shimura agrees, but only after the seas are clear and they've retaken his castle. We inform Yuna of this and, as suspected, she's none too pleased.
Typical samurai, squeezing people for everything they're worth.
That said, I must defend Shimura a little bit here. While I think he's wrong for forcing Yuna to help retake his castle when she's already done her part, he's not wrong in saying that they'll have to wait until the seas are clear. You may remember the vast Mongol fleet that brought Khoten Khan's forces to Tsushima initially. This fleet has by now spread out to cover nearly every part of the island's coastlines, meaning any attempt to escape is fraught with peril, especially without some sort of support on the shore. Retaking Castle Shimura aside, Yuna should be more than aware that getting off Tsushima is easier said than done right now, though it could be argued that Jin should have just simply framed the situation as such instead of using retaking Lord Shimura's home as the reason. It might have saved him from Yuna's venomous response. Mounting up, we follow Lord Shimura out of the castle northward into Toyotama. Along the way, Shimura will ask after Yuna and look for Jin's opinion of her. Regardless of your response, Shimura intimates that he doesn't think highly of her, since she's a thief and, by that fact alone, is someone who lives without honor, despite her clear capabilities as a fighter. We eventually reach the edge of the forest and enter Toyotama proper, only to find the Mongols have done what the Mongols do best: raid and pillage, possibly as revenge for Shimura's escape, while also putting the Japanese at risk of starvation should all the farms suffer the same fate. After taking down a Mongol patrol, we ride for Fort Ito, Shimura wanting to retake it and relight its lighthouse as a symbolic gesture of defiance against Khotan Khan. We fight the Mongols both without and within the fort walls, even getting some help from Yuna when Mongol reinforcements attempt to trap us in the fort. From there, we relight the lighthouse and the core objectives of Act 2 are established. 1. Recruit more warriors for the fight. Yuna suggests that they seek these warriors from the people of Yarikawa, though that's much easier said than done thanks to events preceding the main story as well as concurrent, which we'll discuss when we get there. 2. Petition the shogun for reinforcements from the mainland. How, you may ask? Well, it just so happens that Shimura, in his own words, has unsavory friends of his own, which again we'll discuss when we get there. 3. And lastly, Jin must return home to the Sakai estate and reclaim his father's armor, which has stood empty since he died. This was first mentioned back as they were riding through the forest, in which Jin shows a hint of hesitancy at the idea. We have our marching orders, but before we go, our presence is requested by a prisoner rescued from the fort, a warrior monk named Norio. He and his fellow monks, who came from a temple far to the north, rode south following the disaster at Komoda, only to be ambushed and taken captive, then shoved into a covered pit at Fort Ito, where one by one they were tortured and executed. One of them was Enjo, a renowned warrior, guardian of Cedar Temple, and Norio's brother, something that will become a key plot point during his questline, which from this conversation we gain access to. Following this conversation, we gain Norio's allegiance in the fight against the Mongols, as well as access to Toyotama, where we officially begin Act 2. Act 2 is where the foundations laid in Act 1 are built upon, both in the main story and in subplots of our companions, and where certain plot points that only maybe got a passing reference before are finally given depth, meaning, and in the case of some, importance. This can be seen in the introduction of Norio, but also in Yuna's questline, which we can access upon starting Act 2. Yuna's is only 4 quests though, which is a bit of a shame considering, out of a pretty fantastic cast, Yuna's is perhaps the most interesting, though it's understandable given her importance to the main narrative already. The same goes for Kenji, who only has 3, one of which actually takes place in Izuhara after he helps us rescue Taka. Given that he's the story's only true source of comic relief, it was a real missed opportunity to inject more humor into, again, an extremely humorless story. Some might argue that having more of Kenji would be tonally inconsistent with the narrative at large, which I can understand, though I still disagree. As mentioned before, his humor remains within the bounds of his established character and is done with considerable restraint, and I doubt adding more of it would tip the narrative's tonal balance too far to one side. Our 3 main objectives in Toyotama can be completed in any order, though I recommend you do them in the order that progressively takes you north, starting at Amugi Cove, a pirate town led by the generous yet ruthless Lady Sanjo. There we must seek out a pirate named Goro, who just so happens to be a friend of Lord Shimura's, and just so happens to be indebted to the Jito. We find Goro drinking at Lady Sanjo's, where he begrudgingly agrees to honor his debt. After a quick stop at his house and a run-in with some Ronin, we take a map from him that shows where he's hidden a boat, near Fort Midodake. With that, we meet with Lord Shimura and his chosen men to petition the shogun, then proceed to meet with Goro, who leads us to where his boat is hidden. All looks set, save for one problem. As previously mentioned, the Mongol fleet has near total control of the seas around Tsushima, and Goro fears that there are too many eyes for him to simply slip by. It's then, as they gaze upon Fort Midodake, that Shimura gets an idea. He and Jin will attack the fort and make a ruckus, drawing the attention of the Mongol ships, allowing Goro to slip by unseen. Our attack begins with an ambush of a Mongol patrol before progressively fighting our way inside the fort, where we do exactly as planned: cause a ruckus. Things get slightly complicated when the fort's Hwacha gets involved, but eventually we take the fort regardless. Unfortunately, this has done little to help Goro. Despite the ruckus, the Mongol ships quickly spot his boat and turn their attention to them. Goro isn't completely defenseless, however, for they now have a Hwacha to use against the Mongols. Jin offers to use it, which Shimura begrudgingly agrees to, despite it not being samurai, while he in turn focuses on Mongol reinforcements. The rest of the quest simply requires us to use the Hwacha to shoot the Mongols out of the water, allowing Goro to slip through and make straight for the mainland. Like I mentioned back when we first encountered Hwachas at Castle Canada in the prologue, it's really weird that we're using one here, since they don't technically exist yet and wouldn't for at least another 200 years. Ghost of Tsushima, like any piece of entertainment placed in a historical setting, is often at the mercy of certain liberties being taken, for better or for worse. In the case of video games, this is often done in service to gameplay, but also aesthetics, which is arguably at the core of most of the liberties taken in Ghost. The biggest liberty taken is perhaps the armor worn by Jin and the rest of the samurai, as well as his weapons. Jin's samurai armor, for example, is based on armor from the Sengoku period of the 16th and 17th centuries, not from the Kamakura period of the 13th and 14th. Chris Zimmerman, co-founder of Sucker Punch, stated that they made the change due to 13th century samurai armor looking jarring and not aligning with player expectations. The same can be said about Jin's katana, which technically didn't exist yet. He would have instead used a tachi, a sword similar to a katana but one that differed in length, degree of curvature, and how they were worn when sheathed. Like the armor, the katana was chosen instead due to player expectations, as the katana, according to game director Nate Fox in an interview with GamesBeat, is the quintessential icon of samurai the world over. As for the hwacha, well, that's clearly a gameplay choice, and let's be honest with ourselves, despite not featuring all that much across the game, both in the main story and in the open world, shit's fun as hell to use. With Goro safely through the Mongol blockade, we can finally take a moment to breathe, where Lord Shimura tells Jin some rather important news. In his message to the Shogun, he included an announcement that he wishes to formally adopt Jin as his son, with plans to make it official when the war is over. Shimura has no children of his own, and thus no heir to take the role of Jito when he dies. Jin has pretty much been his son since Jin's father died, and so it only makes sense to do this, to secure his succession as well as his legacy. While it will seem inconsequential now, this new father-son dynamic will come to shape the relationship going forward, as well as have a dramatic impact on how they view each other, especially for Shimura. With the message away, all they can do now is wait for reinforcements. In the meantime, let's continue with their other objectives, starting by meeting with Yuna in the ruins of old Yarikawa. As mentioned, recruiting the aid of Yarikawa's people is easier said than done, thanks to events concurrent and preceding the main story. For one, the Mongols have laid siege to Yarikawa, led by Khoten's right-hand man, Temuge. This ostensibly means that no one can get in or out, though Yuna knows of a way from when she and Taka were children, though the less than confident Taka is skeptical of them reaching it if it even still exists. Secondly, convincing Yarikawa to join with Lord Shimura will be difficult, for Yarikawa has long bore a deep hatred for Clan Shimura, Sakai, and pretty much all the rest of Tsushima. This is thanks to the Yarikawa Rebellion, which took place either before Jin was born or when he was very young. It's not entirely clear when. Lord Tokiyasa Yarikawa led his clan in revolt against Clan Shimura to take control of Tsushima. The rebellion was put down by Lord Shimura, though at the cost of his father and all of his brothers, the number of which is unknown, which in turn landed him the title of Jito. His putting down of the rebellion, which ended with Lord Tokiyasa's execution and the disbandment of Clan Yarikawa, has been noted as particularly brutal, as evidenced by the ruins of old Yarikawa, and may have included the slaughter of innocents, which goes very much against the grain of Lord Shimura's ideals, that the samurai are the example of which all people should strive to uphold. Since then, the people of Yarikawa have had a long-standing hatred for Clan Shimura, a hatred that is somewhat extended to Clan Sakai as well. This puts Jin in a doubly difficult position. Convincing the people of Yarikawa to fight for Lord Shimura is hard enough, even with the Mongols right on their doorstep, but to do so as both the lord of a severely disliked Clan Sakai and as Shimura's nephew? Yeah, I think you get the idea. Lord Shimura, for his part, is well aware of his hated status in Yarikawa and counters this with an equal amount of contempt for Yarikawa and its people, as evidenced by how he speaks to Yuna when she reveals that she's from there, though this could just be an extension of his already well-known distrust of her. All that, however, will only matter if they can get inside Yarikawa, and that remains to be seen. Things look grim when we reach the outskirts of Yarikawa and find the Mongols have completely encircled the town. With no other choice, we sneak our way through the camp, killing only when necessary until we reach the river that forms the town's moat. Once across, we find the secret entrance is still there and make inside Yarikawa proper. Once inside, we're immediately confronted by two defenders who immediately question Jin. Once Taka reveals him to be the ghost, without mentioning his name I might add, they agree to take him to Ujimasa Yarikawa, steward of Yarikawa. Before we get to him though, we're drawn to a commotion at the main gate. Temuge has approached to make Yarikawa a simple offer. Surrender and no mercy. Resist and be subject to great misery, aka mass slaughter and enslavement, before leaving to let the townsfolk stew over it. Now we can meet Ujimasa Yarikawa, youngest son of Lord Tokiyasa Yarikawa. Despite Lord Shimura disbanding it, Clan Yarikawa still runs things here, even if unofficially. By all indications, Yarikawa has become a sort of self-autonomous city on Tsushima, a sort of backwater, forgotten by the rest once the rebellion was put down. As expected, Jin and Ujimasa get off on the wrong foot almost immediately, with only Yuna keeping things from escalating. Ujimasa foolishly expects the Mongols to eventually lose interest in Yarikawa since their main focus is on the mainland, and thus turns down Jin's proposal of breaking the siege in exchange for helping Lord Shimura. Things already look pretty bleak until we meet up with Taka, who's learned some interesting information. All of Yarikawa's best archers left to fight the Mongols, against Ujimasa's orders, and haven't been seen for some time. Naturally, Jin and Yuna agree to look for these archers as they may be the key to breaking the siege, and agree to meet in the ruins of old Yarikawa to search for them. When we meet with Yuna, we also see that Taka has joined as well, going against Yuna's wishes. Even Jin is unsure about his being there as he's far from a trained warrior, but relents when Taka insists that he can help. Our search for the archers progressively takes us away from the ruins into an abandoned shack that they used as a camp. From the camp, we spot some of the archers clambering up a hill. Following them, we find the rest of them, led by a man named Daikoku. He and his men are tracking a number of their fellow archers that were captured by the Mongols in a failed raid. As we can see from the hill, the Mongols are preparing to move them, taking a route that cuts through old Yarikawa. After some brief deliberation, everyone agrees to ambush the Mongols there, using some explosives stolen from them in the process. We then cut back to where the quest originally started, with Jin, Yuna, Taka, and the archers spread out across the rooftops. Yuna wants Taka to go hide somewhere, but Taka refuses, wanting to stay and fight, with Jin, much to Yuna's frustration, refusing to decide for him when asked. Once Yuna's gone, Jin and Taka will have a conversation regarding the nature of fear, either how it's natural to be afraid or how it can be used to fuel you in a fight. The Mongols then show up with the prisoners and we proceed to cut them down, including waves of reinforcements that bring up their rear. Simultaneously, all the prisoners are freed. The ambush is a resounding success. Before we return to Yarikawa, however, Yuna wants a word with Jin. Suffice it to say, she's not pleased that Taka took part in the battle, despite the fact that he handled himself pretty well, then essentially warns Jin to back off when he suggests that she needs to stop holding him back and let him learn to take care of himself. I can't really say why this conversation is important just yet, for it will have to be taken in context with events later in Act 2 as well as Yuna's side quest chain, but for now, know what's said here will come back to haunt both Jin and Yuna, so make a mental note of it for now. We're immediately transported back to Yarikawa Stronghold, where we can begin the next and final phase of the siege, first by talking to Taka, then meeting with Yuna in the main keep. Along the way, we can also speak with an inspired Daikoku and a thankful and almost apologetic Ujimasa who still hasn't decided whether to help Lord Shimura once the siege has been lifted. We find Yuna on the top floor, overlooking Yarikawa, where the two share a bottle of sake before we get a transition where one bottle has turned into 5, night having fallen over the town. As inevitably happens when drinking, looser lips soon follow, and we get some insight into how Yuna became the woman that she is and why she's so protective of Taka. As mentioned before, both of them were born and raised in Yarikawa, and right from the get-go were handed a rotten lot in life. Father was out of the picture not long after Taka was born, and their mother was an abusive alcoholic, going so far as to break Taka's arm when he was only 6 years old. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, for right after, Yuna took Taka and the two fled Yarikawa, finding out only a month later that their mother had died, found face down in the street. Since then, they've lived a nomadic lifestyle, Yuna watching over Taka while he trained to become the talented blacksmith he is. This moment between Yuna and Jin, while heavy regardless, will perhaps hold even more weight for you if you've done her questline beforehand, for it's from these quests that we learn what happened right after they left Yarikawa. In brief, after they fled, Yuna accepted help from a man known only as the Black Wolf, believing him to be trustworthy. Turns out he was quite the opposite, however, and he enslaved both Yuna and Taka, with there being a strong suggestion that he, had his way with Taka, something that Taka thankfully doesn't remember. They were eventually sold to the cruel Mamushi brothers, who ran a slave farm in Otsuna Prefecture and weren't shy about abusing, torturing, or just straight up executing their slaves for whatever reason they chose. They eventually escaped with the help of another slave named Ichi, though she was unfortunately recaptured in the attempt, a fact that, when we meet her, has led to some built-up animosity towards Yuna. We learn all this while attempting to take down a Mongol warlord named Altan, who's been terrorizing and enslaving the people of Otsuna and working with both the Black Wolf and the Mamushi brothers, drawing Altan out by hunting down and killing those depraved motherfuckers, before inevitably killing the warlord himself in a duel. When all that is taken in context with what Yuna tells us in Yarikawa's main keep, then her behavior towards and with regards to Taka all begins to make sense, and gives this scene, after we rescue the captured archers, all the more weight. Their lives have been nothing short of a factory of sadness and misery, with perhaps an unhealthy amount of looking over one's shoulder in Yuna's case, protecting a younger brother who, despite everything, maintains a strong sense of gentleness and kindness. She wants to give him a better life, free from the pain and suffering they endured as children, even if that means keeping him hidden and safe under her kimono and bearing the entire brunt of whatever danger comes their way. It's a dynamic that Jin has unintentionally disrupted, with Taka becoming inspired to become more involved in the fight against the Mongols to show bravery, even if that means putting himself in harm's way. This flies in the face of what Yuna's trying to achieve, hence her vitriol when Jin doesn't do what she asks and lets Taka help with rescuing the archers, then again during the conversation at the end of the quest. It's at Yarikawa's main keep that Jin comes to understand Yuna in this regard, I think, and perhaps has some amount of regret over what he said before, as well as having a moment of self-realization, a moment that will have greater weight much later in the story, as evidenced by what he says at the end of the cutscene.
Sometimes, our only choice is to walk away from everything we know.
We then jump forward a bit to Jin waking up to the sound of explosions and war horns, with Yuna hurriedly telling him that it's time. The Mongols are attacking. We hurry through the town to the main gate where Yarikawa's defenders have gathered, while Taka gathers the non-combatants and directs them to the keep. Almost as soon as we reach the gate, the Mongols break through and a chaotic and brutal melee ensues. This melee, after some time, will transition to another gate further along the wall where we repeat the process before the Mongols mysteriously pull back, despite having more than enough men to swamp the defenders with ease. It's then that some catapults are revealed on some cliffs overlooking Yarikawa, which begin to bombard the town. Jin resolves to destroy them, leaving Yuna to lead the defenders in holding back the next assault. From here, we sneak through the Mongol siege camp to reach the catapults, engaging with them along the way if we choose. Once on the cliffs, we simply engage and slaughter the crews before destroying the catapults themselves. Unfortunately, destroying the catapults proves not to be enough, for as soon as we're done, we see the Mongols stream inside, the defenders forced to fall back to the keep. From here, we proceed to sneak back into Yarikawa, taking down Mongols we come across at our own leisure. Once back inside the walls, we can hear Temuge condemn Yarikawa to death as we slowly work our way back to the keep, taking down any Mongols in our way and rescuing any civilians they've taken captive in the process. Once inside the main grounds of the keep, we find Temuge and immediately initiate a duel, while the rest of the defenders fiercely continue fighting the Mongols. The duel itself isn't really anything to write home about, it's much the same as the other duels you'll come across save for one. These bosses, which are either encountered in the open world or in side quests, Temuge accepted, are just variations of their grunt counterparts with the exact same animations and movesets, the difference being that they do more damage and have a larger health bar. The difference with Temuge is what happens after you defeat him. When you whittle his health down to almost zero, a cutscene will play, where a heavily wounded Temuge will stumble away while his men look on, bewildered. You'll then be prompted to slaughter him, which in this case results in Jin stabbing Temuge through the chest before promptly beheading him, terrifying the Mongols and signifying Jin's full embracement of his status as the Ghost. Since Yuna's proclamation back at Komatsu Forge, the people of Tsushima have come to refer to Jin as the Ghost, a title that has only gotten more and more entrenched with every action he takes against the Mongols, be it in the main story or in the open world. It has also garnered attention from the Mongols, with Khotan Khan even telling a captured Lord Shimura at Castle Kaneda that Jin's reputation as the Ghost has taken root amongst his men. This is mostly represented in-game by Jin's legend, which also determines how easy it is to terrify enemies and how many at any given time, which is also determined by your gear and actions. Jin initially will attempt to stifle it, for it stands in direct contention with the samurai code, but as the war with the Mongols grows more brutal and unforgiving, he allows the moniker to take deeper root, to inspire fear in his enemies and hope for the people of Tsushima, even if he hasn't yet embraced it, though even that begins to change the further along we go. That change comes to full fruition with the death of Temuge, as the fury of the Ghost and the power it wields is brought to ferocious life and made manifest with one of the most epic combat mechanics I've seen in any video game, the Ghost Stance. When you achieve 7 kills in a row, or slaughter a Mongol leader from stealth, you'll be prompted with the chance to enter the Ghost Stance during combat, in which you're essentially allowed 3 free kills, while your enemies, be they Mongols, bandits, or Straw Hats, back away in fear, such as the terror invoked by the stance, and can even compel some enemies to flee once the stance is over. The mechanic itself is fairly straightforward, but what makes it so epic is what it represents. It's like Jin has given himself over to some sort of otherworldly power and briefly becomes the monster his enemies believe him to be, coupled with a sudden howling windstorm and the black and white filter beautifully and lovingly ripped straight from samurai cinema, which will flash to red as Jin makes a kill. In the case of Yarikawa, this act is what finally breaks the Mongols and inspires the defenders to launch a vicious counterattack from the main keep, sweeping across the town and hunting down every last Mongol caught within its walls, sparing no one, just as Jin commands. Some Mongols will bravely attempt to resist, but all are cut down without quarter, in a rare instance of the game making Jin a one-hit kill machine. The Mongols are eventually driven back across the bridge leading into town, and the fighting comes to a halt. Yarikawa has been saved, though at a terrible cost. We're then treated to a cutscene, where a bloody Jin calls upon the people of Yarikawa to support Lord Shimura in driving the Mongols from Tsushima. Supported by Taka and Yuna, he inspires the people of Yarikawa, who all bow before him, both a sign of respect and thanks for his efforts, and a declaration of loyalty to him, to the Ghost. Now we have our army, but there's still one more thing we need to do before we can rejoin Lord Shimura and retake his castle. We need to reclaim the Sakai armor, previously worn by Jin's father, Kazumasa. For that, we must make for the village of Omi, seat of Clan Sakai and the location of the Sakai estate. Arriving at Omi is rather strange, for the entire village appears abandoned despite being left untouched by the Mongol invasion. Then again, it's not that much different from any other settlement in the game, for even those with an active population feel rather lifeless when compared to urban set pieces in other games. In a game world as immersive as Ghosts, its urban environments are by far its weakest aspect. That's not to say that they're completely dead, but when compared to other games that came out the same year or even before, they feel rather stale and kinda boring to explore. I can accept that they weren't a primary focus for the developers and that there are obvious narrative explanations for this. I'm also willing to admit that I'm a bit biased. I love urban set pieces in video games, they're by far my favorite environs to explore. Mainly for me, it just feels like a missed opportunity in Ghost of Tsushima to build on an already incredibly immersive experience, for its urban set pieces on the face of it are interesting, but ultimately they're just that, set pieces. In the case of Omi Village, it's very clear that it's just been straight up abandoned, its denizens having probably fled to Castle Shimura following news of the samurai defeat at Komoda Beach. That said, I do find it strange that the Mongols haven't come through here and picked it clean or even razed it to the ground. Clan Sakai is not some backwater clan, they're one of the most powerful on Tsushima, second only to Clan Shimura, who are even bonded together by marriage, Jin's mother and Kazumasa's wife, Chiyoko, being Lord Shimura's sister. The Mongols were masters of psychological warfare, and Khoten Khan has already proven himself adept at it as well, so I find it hard to believe that he wouldn't have ordered the looting and subsequent destruction of Omi and the Sakai estate, knowing how much damage such an action would probably do to Japanese morale. Like, could you imagine if he'd gotten a hold of the infamous Sakai clan armor? This part of the story as presented now isn't bad, in fact it's just as good as the others in this act, but I can't help but wonder what could have been if they had gone in the direction as just presented. Jin returning to his home only to find it destroyed and the armor missing. Together, with the help of some friends who we'll be meeting in a short bit, we search for the armor while simultaneously exploring and analyzing aspects of Jin's upbringing and how they've made him the man he is today. Ironically, the missing armor plot point is already in the game. You may remember, back in the prologue, the flashback where we see young Jin bow before his father's armor on display in the front foyer. Walking inside, we'll find the display empty before we're confronted by Yuriko, Clan Sakai's caretaker, who you'll have briefly met back in that aforementioned flashback. Yuriko will initially think Jin an intruder before falling to her knees in shock and disbelief, believing that Jin had died at Komoda Beach. After taking a moment to compose herself, we learn that she's hidden the armor and we set off to retrieve it. We meet with a man named Taichi, who's busy tending the grounds around the Sakai family cemetery. While Taichi goes with Yuriko to fetch the Sakai armor, we, controlling Jin, opt to pay our respects at Kazumasa's grave. So now I think would be a good time to discuss Kazumasa. While there's no question the base game is pretty blunt about what happened, the circumstances surrounding his death and the effect it's had on Jin beyond what we've seen so far isn't explored until the Iki Island DLC. To begin to understand Kazumasa is to understand what little is known about Chiyoko, his wife and Jin's mother. By all accounts, she was the one who did most of the work raising Jin, nurturing the more gentle side of his character, along with teaching him how to play the flute and write haikus. That's not to suggest that Kazumasa was absent, however, as he was still very much present, and he and Lord Shimura shared the duty of teaching Jin what it meant to be samurai, all while sporting a well-documented sense of humor. It's also suggested by Yuriko that Kazumasa would have approved of Jin's status as the Ghost, as he too was known to use less than samurai-approved tactics, and believed Lord Shimura was too rigid and incapable of flexibility, which is something that will rear its ugly head a little later. That all changed, however, when Chiyoko got sick, and eventually passed away from said illness when Jin was only 7 years old. Kazumasa, stricken by grief, lost his sense of humor, and unable to cope with parenthood since he left most of that to Chiyoko, threw himself into his duty as a samurai. One of these was an invasion of Iki, an island he had previously visited in his youth and had now become overrun by pirates and bandits. Kazumasa, wishing to set an example for his son on the battlefield, brought a young Jin with him, making the Iki campaign Jin's earliest exposure to warfare. The campaign on Iki was less a war and more a slugging match between the samurai and the island's criminal bands, one that led to widespread devastation and the slaughter and displacement of innocents, and earned Kazumasa the title Butcher of Iki. The campaign came to a swift and violent end when Kazumasa, with Jin in tow, and his forces were ambushed at a place called Senjo Gorge. Despite his valiant efforts, Kazumasa was eventually disarmed, had his leg broken, then unceremoniously slain by a bandit, a moment which we'll have seen a few times already. Jin was present for that moment, but despite his father's pleas, he failed to help him, instead slinking in fear. It's not clear how Jin managed to get out of that situation himself, but regardless, it's a moment that has haunted him since, epitomized by his refusal to wear his father's armor at Komoda Beach. Jin was able to excise the guilt somewhat when he rescued Lord Shimura from Castle Kaneda, which in turn allowed him to work up the courage to finally don the clan Sakai armor, the last of his lingering guilt dissipating as he dons the fearsome Sakai mask. Even still, Kazumasa's legacy lives on with Jin, though not in the way you may expect. The guiding wind isn't just a unique take on waypoints and directional markers, it's a manifestation of Kazumasa's spirit guiding Jin, even in death. The same can be said for Chiyoko, whose spirit is represented by the many yellow birds we come across on our travels. These yellow birds, should you choose to follow them, will lead you to any nearby points of interest: bamboo strikes, hot springs, haikus, and fox dens. Many fox dens. Once Jin dons the armor, he steps outside to meet Yuriko, who is shocked by his presence, briefly believing him to be Kazumasa. We're then interrupted by some straw hats, who we promptly dispatch in a standoff, the Sakai armor granting particular buffs for that mechanic. Yuriko, shocked by what she's just seen, needs a moment to collect herself, and together, her and Jin head to the lake, to the sparring ring where we had our combat tutorial with Lord Shimura back in the prologue. Along the way, Jin will ask Yuriko about the poison she makes to keep vermin out of the food stores, which she'll have mentioned earlier as we head to meet with Taichi upon our return to the estate. Jin will ask if she can make it stronger, enough to kill a man. Yuriko will insist that no one deserves such a fate, before remarking at the tree that poison has never been the Sakai way, though, as Jin astutely points out, no Sakai before has ever had to face the Mongols. Jin insists on the use of poison, intending to use a blowgun and darts to stick the poison into the enemy, since it needs to be consumed somehow to work. Yuriko relents on the condition that Jin remains the man she knows, regardless of his actions. With all agreed, we now just need the means to make a blowgun. For that we need a hollow reed, which Yuriko says can be found downriver at the village of Kishibe, which straddles both sides of the river. Unfortunately, though unsurprisingly, the Mongols have occupied the village, complicating our reed-picking escapade. Nevertheless, we get the reed, kill some Mongols if necessary, perhaps even liberate the whole village while we're at it just for funsies, then return to Yuriko at the sparring ring. From there, we follow Yuriko to a small camp she keeps in the woods where we find the plant used to make the poison, which I believe is wolfsbane. We then jump forward a bit, signified by a fade to black, of which there are very many in the game, to when Yuriko finishes the poison. It's then that we hear voices. Investigating from the top of a cliff overlooking the road, we find more straw hats, looking for Jin and Yuriko, out to avenge the ones we slaughtered back at the Sakai estate earlier. Being the perfect opportunity to test it out, we fire a poison dart into one of the straw hats, who immediately starts choking on and coughing up blood before convulsing in the mud, then finally dying while his companions flee in terror. The poison is a resounding success. We speak with Yuriko one last time, at least with regards to this particular quest, where Jin will ask about what other poisons we can make. Yuriko will mention one that causes confusion and rage, but that she can't remember the ingredients. In any event, this conversation concludes this particular quest, as well as opening the way to begin Yuriko's short but wonderfully crafted two-part questline, where we unlock the secondary poison, as well as learn some rather interesting things about both Yuriko and Kazumasa, and concludes with one of the more moving cutscenes in the entire game.
Yuriko? Rest, Yuriko. The strength we need is all around us. The mighty fall at last, to be no more than dust before the wind.
And that is that. We've now got everything we need to take back Castle Shimura. Once we're ready, we can head to Lord Shimura's staging camp and begin final preparations for driving out the Mongols for good. Once we arrive at Lord Shimura's staging camp, we meet with the man himself, where he gives Jin his flowers for getting him an army as well as for retrieving his family armor. However, that's about the long and short of it, for there's a new problem, one that must be resolved before the Shogun's reinforcements arrive. Shimura's scouts intercepted orders from the Khan addressed to Ryuzo. The Straw Hats, or what's left of them at this point, are poised to strike their flank, probably as they march for Castle Shimura. Obviously, that means they must be dealt with, or at least Ryuzo needs to be. He's currently holed up in Fort Koyosan, though Shimura states Jin doesn't need to be the one to face him. Jin, however, feels otherwise and agrees to go after him. Before we head out, we check on Yuna to see if she wishes to join us. Unfortunately, she doesn't. Lord Shimura has come through on his payment. She and Taka are on the first boat to the mainland come dawn, and it's an opportunity she doesn't want to risk missing by chasing after Jin's vendetta. Jin's disappointed, but understanding, before telling Taka to make sure he listens to his sister, before they give each other their goodbyes, and we set out for Fort Koyasan. Arriving at the fort, we wait until nightfall before scouting it out, taking up a position on a cliff overlooking the front section, which is teeming with Mongols and Straw Hats. Before we can continue further, Taka appears from out of nowhere, wishing to help in Yuna's stead. Jin is initially against the idea, but relents when Taka offers to be a distraction, to pull some of the Mongols away from the fort and better Jin's odds at reaching Ryuzo, who's no doubt hiding deeper in. Taka then puts his part of the plan in action, riding to the front gate and shouting all sorts of insults at the Mongols. As expected, most of the Mongols give chase, opening the way for Jin to sneak inside. It isn't all smooth sailing, however, as there are still some Mongols left to contend with, both in the front area and in a raised sublevel overlooking it. Once we dealt with the Mongols, however, we're free to proceed to the next gated section of the fort, where we find Ryuzo, waiting for us. But why would he want to be found? Well, apparently Koten wants to meet Jin in person, and to that end, Ryuzo let his location be known, expecting Jin to come deal with him personally. Before the Khan supposedly meets Jin, Ryuzo will attempt to reason with him, perhaps compel him to switch sides, to save Tsushima, but Jin isn't having any of it. Seeing that he isn't about to change his mind, Ryuzo gives a signal, and this happens. Well, shit. When Jin reawakens, it's to the voice of Taka urging him to do just that. We then find that both men have been tied to posts in Fort Koyasan. Now you may be thinking that Jin getting captured all of a sudden is a bit of forced dramatic tension, but in fact this bit was foreshadowed much earlier in the act. Following the defeat of the Mongols at Yarikawa and the death of Temuge, we cut to Koten Khan and Ryuzo having a meeting in Castle Shimura. Put simply, the Khan's men were beginning to believe that Jin was invincible, and that Ryuzo needed to prove them wrong. Ryuzo is initially doubtful, saying that Jin's the best swordsman on the island, that no one can defeat him in combat, but the Khan counters by saying that he just simply needs to find another way, for there are many ways to defeat an enemy. It's then that Ryuzo makes this suggestion.
What if we didn't have to kill him?
Fast forward to the present, and we see such a plan bear fruit. Jin not killed, but captured, though to what ends remains a mystery, beyond Koten Khan wanting to have a word with him. But what's Taka doing here? In short, when he noticed that Jin had been gone far too long, he realized that he was in trouble and came back to help, but got captured in the process. Now both men are tied to posts in the middle of a hostile fort with no idea as to what's going to happen next. Both will attempt to loosen their bonds until Taka sees someone approaching. The big man himself, Koten Khan.
You must be thirsty.
Before we see what happens in this verbal duel of opposed wills, let's just take a moment to discuss the Khan himself, as he's been rightly considered to be one of the highlights of the story, from how he's written to how he's performed. Koten ranks high among my favorite video game villains. In fact, I put him high on the list of my favorite villains in any form of media. It could have been very easy for the writers at Sucker Punch to make him what the great Joseph Anderson would describe as a Saturday morning cartoon villain, but instead they made him to be utterly compelling without sacrificing the said villainous aspects of his character. At no point is he ever made to be agreeable or sympathetic. This is made abundantly clear when we're first introduced to him back at Komoda Beach and kills Lord Adachi via less than subtle means, but I don't think the point of that scene is just to point out his villainy. Him being in charge of the invasion alone is enough to put him on that pedestal. Just think about what preceded his introduction. Lord Shimura's speech about the tenets of the samurai code: tradition, courage, and honor. By doing what he did, he directly attacked the very values our heroic samurai stand for, before following this up with an offer of surrender. He's quickly made out to be a ruthless pragmatist, as best exemplified when he speaks to Lord Shimura on the beach after the samurai are slaughtered. Someone who doesn't care about how something gets done, so long as it is, though he isn't above making a show of it if it works in his favor. His pragmatic side comes when attempting to sway Lord Shimura to his cause, first on the beach, then again at Castle Canada, and also with Jin, on the bridge in the prologue and, as we'll see in a bit, here in Fort Koyasan. He also shows a combination of the two when we first see him with Ryuzo, when he forces him to burn prisoners alive so that he'll feed his men. It represents his keen understanding of people and their motivations, coupled with clever means in which to turn said motivations against them. Jin in his desire to save his people, Ryuzo in his desire to feed his men, and Lord Shimura in his supposed desire to accrue more power, though this last one evidently fails and is only a rumor found in a collectible record. He does all this with a sinister calmness, which makes him all the more terrifying, or at the very least, spine-chilling, particularly in his mannerisms and dialogue delivery, performed brilliantly by Patrick Gallagher, who you may recognize from his role as another famous nomad lord called Attila the Hun in the Night at the Museum films. In many ways, he shares quite a bit in common with Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones and Emir Var Emreis in The Witcher 3, both characters portrayed by Charles Dance. Menacingly calm, unafraid to do what they feel is necessary to achieve their aims, though also more than willing to gnash their teeth when needed. This scene with Jin and Taka in Fort Koyasan, for me, is by far the best one of Khotun Khan in the entire game, where everything is about as a character is perfectly exemplified. It begins with him offering both Jin and Taka some arag, fermented mare's milk, taken from his favorite horse, which he butchered and fed to his men after it broke its leg the day before. He'll then proceed in attempting to convince Jin to surrender, and convince his people to do the same, knowing that his status as the ghost lends him much sway over them. Of course, Jin essentially tells him where he can take his pretty speech and shove it, so Khotun steps it up a gear, first by freeing Taka, then giving him Jin's sword, telling him that if he kills the ghost, he'll be free to go, masquerading as a test of loyalty. Jin tells Taka to run, knowing Taka doesn't stand a chance if he tries to fight, but instead the blacksmith attempts to attack the Khan, but is easily put down in the mud, before the Khan takes Jin's sword and does this.
Your friend died for you. Now I must find another, and you must choose again.
As the Khan walks away, leaving Taka's headless body to lie in the mud, Jin lets out an uncharacteristic scream of rage and anguish, letting free his emotions, breaking yet another tenet of Lord Shimura's lessons, that a samurai is not to be ruled by emotion. Easier said than done when one of your friends has just been unceremoniously executed right in front of you and left to rot. We then jump forward in time, finding Jin still tied to the post, Taka's headless corpse still lying in the mud. We'll then be shown a button prompt which allows Jin to pull himself free of his bonds, which does make me wonder just how well tied they were in the first place. Right away, Jin resolves to find his sword. We find that in his gear in a nearby chest, and once he has it all on, he drops a spine-chilling line.
Kill them all.
Gone is the strict emotional control Jin enforced upon himself. Now he wants blood. He gets his blood from the Straw Hats assigned to guard him, who can quickly be dispatched with a successful standoff as well as use of the ghost dance. Once they're taken care of, our attention turns to the gate out of the compound. As we approach, the gate suddenly opens and we're met by Yuna. Shit. Yuna has come to Fort Koyasan looking for Taka after he left her a message saying that he'd followed after Jin. Jin can't find the words to tell her, but his broken expression is enough to foretell what has happened, to which Yuna sprints past him towards where they were tied up, while Jin vainly begs her to wait.
Why didn't he listen?
Yuna will collapse and sob over Taka's body, her worst fear imaginable realized, while Jin can only look on, helpless in the face of reality, in one of the game's lowest emotional points, if not the lowest. Yuna will initially blame Jin, for it was his example, as the ghost, that inspired Taka to greater acts of bravery and risk, reaching its zenith in his attempt to kill Khoten. Some have argued that it's a tad bit unfair of Yuna to blame Jin. After all, Taka is more than old enough to make his own decisions, but that would be completely forgetting about everything we've learned about his and Yuna's relationship leading up to this point. Her whole life has been spent protecting Taka, keeping him alive and safe in a world that has only caused him great harm. Then, for the one moment he's out of her sight, he's brutally cut down, his head thrown into the mud like common trash, all because he was inspired to great heroism by the actions of one man, Jin Sakai. And so, in her delirious and heartbroken state, it's only understandable that she would lash out at him, especially since he's right there, regardless of whether or not he's worthy of blame. To Jin's credit, he doesn't exactly correct her or rebuke her, only that he tried to send him away, but he insisted on staying to help. It's then that we're interrupted by the arrival of more Straw Hats, this time with Mongol reinforcements. Jin suggests that they make their exit, but Yuna refuses to leave Taka's body behind, and together they face the coming onslaught. The Mongols and Straw Hats come in several waves, but each are viciously cut down by Jin and Yuna, who will simultaneously shout all sorts of obscenities in their direction. Eventually, the last of them are taken care of, and we can finally rest easy for a bit, and have some cause to celebrate. The Straw Hats at Fort Koyasan were the last of Ryuzo's men. Now that they've all either been killed or fled, Ryuzo stands alone. It also means that Khoten has lost a valuable source of manpower, though in that regard it ultimately means very little since its own forces are still quite numerous. This success is sharply tempered and quickly forgotten when Yuna makes clear her desire to bury Taka, with Jin offering his help. We then quickly cut to the cliffs just outside Yarikawa, where Taka has been buried, marked by a post with his headband around it. The two will converse for a bit, placing blame for Taka's death squarely on the Mongols, with Yuna resolving to stay on Tsushima and continue fighting, now that she doesn't have a reason to leave anymore. Both agree to meet at Lord Shimura's camp before we return to the open world.
Was Taka brave? At the end?
He was always brave.
Arriving at the camp, we're confronted by two samurai in colors not yet seen. They are of clan Oga, led by Lord Tadamune Oga, and are the reinforcements from the mainland that we've been waiting for. Lord Oga tells us that Lord Shimura has just issued the order to advance on Castle Shimura. Before we join Lord Oga, we need to check in with Yuna first, who's arrived ahead of us, as well as our other companions, who are each doing their part to ready the men for the assault. After we meet with Yuna and converse for a bit, where she reminds us that the people of Yarikawa are there for Jin the Ghost, we join Lord Oga and his retinue and ride for a nearby tower on a hill, with Lord Shimura at the top. On this ride, Lord Oga will ask Jin about the name the people of Tsushima have given him, the Ghost. Jin will answer that it was all just to give the people something to believe in after Komoda Beach, to which Lord Oga will reply that, with the samurai now back, it's time to put such folktales to bed and re-establish the Shogun's law, a remark that Jin takes exception to. This is the very moment where the Shogun enters the chat, the issue of the ghost going from being merely a Tsushima problem to one that concerns the mainland as well. We'll go into more detail into why later, as for now it isn't all that important. Yet. At the tower, we meet with Lord Shimura and inform him of what happened at Fort Koyasan, speaking to the Khan, Taka's death, eliminating the Straw Hats, etc. Lord Shimura will then share the news that the Shogun has accepted his request to adopt Jin as his son, with Lord Shimura making it abundantly clear that Jin will be heir to Clan Shimura not as a ghost, but as a samurai. After a brief cut to Khoten and Ryuzo, we then cut to Jin riding with Shimura, Oga, and Yuna as they follow the road to Castle Shimura, while Japanese forces begin final deployments, with Mongols waiting just beyond, in a pretty epic scene. It's then that the order to charge is made, and battle is joined. The quest in battle is pretty straightforward. All you have to do is press forward and slaughter the Mongols as they come, capturing gates and sections of the castle as you go. The Mongols, to their credit, make it far from easy, and the fighting very quickly devolves into a slaughter-filled slugging match. Despite this, however, our forces do gain ground, forcing the Mongols to ever so gradually fall back. Problems do arise, however, among the Japanese ranks. After we make it inside the castle and capture the first section, Lord Shimura will order Jin to scout ahead. On the other side, a Mongol officer berates the Japanese, but is cut off when Jin uses some poison darts on his men before jumping down and decapitating the officer and sending the Mongols fleeing. Just as the Japanese break through, with Lord Shimura bearing witness to Jin's actions. Lord Shimura, instead of being grateful that the way is clear, immediately berates Jin for what he's done, the first true sign of tension between them. Before it can escalate, however, the Mongols begin raining hwacha fire down on them, forcing the Japanese to take cover, and the battle is back on. We eventually force the Mongols to retreat to the main keep, which is separated from the rest of the castle by a river and waterfall, with the only means of access being a narrow bridge. As Japanese troops surge across the bridge, Jin senses something is very wrong. Why would the Khan just allow for this to happen? Turns out Jin's spidey senses were correct. We see the Mongols close the gates, then prepare several horse-drawn wagons, laden with explosives. Suddenly, they burst from behind the gate and charge across the bridge, sending the Japanese fleeing while we desperately attempt to stop them, but to no avail. The wagons explode and destroy the bridge, killing many in the process.
Those poor souls.
He sent them to die. For nothing.
Lord Shimura resolves to simply repair the bridge and try again tomorrow, throwing more of his men into the meat grinder, but Jin refuses, stating bluntly that there is another way. Angered, Lord Shimura states that they will discuss the matter alone. They meet in a nearby tower, and it's in this scene that the inflexibility and hypocrisy of Lord Shimura is fully unveiled, though there have been hints here and there leading up to this point. Jin chastises his uncle for his decisions, particularly with regards to the bridge, having ordered the men to blindly charge across, despite the fact that something was very clearly wrong, though Shimura brushes this off by saying that they are soldiers. Jin will then suggest that he can sneak across the bridge and discreetly poison the remaining Mongols, ending the fighting before more Japanese lives are lost. Shimura is absolutely beyond bewildered by this. The man he's trained for years to fight with honor is now suggesting that they use an act of terror? Preposterous. He'll declare that Jin is ruled by emotion, to which Jin responds by calling him out for what can be bluntly described as his lack of effort, while Jin was busy sacrificing everything he knew to save Tsushima and its people. Shimura's response:
You did nothing!
No. We're finished.
Alright, let's take a moment and finally discuss Lord Shimura for a moment now that the mask has finally come off. Let's start with what kickstarted this whole scene and has been brewing since we released Lord Shimura from Castle Canada: his inflexibility. It's no secret that Shimura is a strict follower of the samurai code. One could argue that it's his defining trait, the embodiment of his entire being. It's also come to define him as a general and leader of men, where every battle must be fought with honor, facing the enemy head on. That's all well and good against other samurai, but they aren't fighting other samurai. As mentioned back in the prologue, the Mongols couldn't give two shits about the samurai code of honor. They're here to conquer, and will do whatever they feel is necessary to achieve that. Genghis Khan, the greatest and most famous Mongol in history, didn't win his empire by always being honorable. Fear and wanton destruction of peoples and places, which we've seen plenty of throughout this story, was a readily used tactic by the Mongols, particularly against peoples who refused to surrender and submit to the will of the Khan. With that in mind, Khotan Khan's actions in reality are just applications of standard Mongol doctrine, with his own personal flair. Jin has learned that fighting the Mongols takes more than having a sharp sword and deadly skills. Sometimes you have to fight fear with fear, for it's the only language they understand, along with being willing to get your hands dirty, even at the cost of some of your dignity. Shimura hasn't, because he's more concerned with doing what he feels is right and not what's necessary, as highlighted earlier in the siege when he admonishes Jin for using poison and terrifying the Mongols into retreat earlier, even though it proved to be the smart thing to do. Consequently, it's made him incapable of making the necessary adjustments to solve certain problems. Case in point, the blown up bridge. Almost any other general would jump at the chance to poison the enemy, saving their own men in the process, but because it goes against the samurai code, Shimura wants nothing to do with it. He'd rather just keep throwing his own men at the problem because they're warriors and should fight and die with honor, and accuses Jin of being too emotional because he wants to use the Mongols' own fear against them. That last point feeds into the next aspect of Shimura's character that has become crystal clear for all to see: his hypocrisy. At multiple points in the story, both in the present and in the flashbacks to Jin's youth, we've seen Lord Shimura espouse the belief that a samurai isn't ruled by their emotions, that they must do everything with a calm, clear head, only to fall foul of this rule when he slaps Jin, showing that he isn't the prime example of calm and collected that he claims to be. He also shows a startling lack of care for the people he rules, being rather condescending towards them, and a willingness to send his lesser soldiers to their deaths to serve his own ends. This is in spite of constantly preaching the samurai's need to set the example of honor and courage, which would suggest that he would gladly stand shoulder to shoulder with them, but no, he rarely does that. We'd also be remiss if we didn't mention his relationship with the pirate Goro. Early in Act 2, there's some simmering tension between Shimura and Yuna, with Shimura frowning upon Jin's relationship with her, often derisively referring to her as a thief. Yet simultaneously, he maintains a relationship with Goro, a pirate whom he caught in the act of smuggling Chinese silk, but instead of punishing him harshly as the law would demand, he simply burned his stock and let him go, on the condition that Goro helped Shimura in the future when asked. This is, by far, the most blatant act of hypocrisy by Shimura. On the one hand, he admonishes Jin for befriending a thief, one who saved Jin's life, while at the same time he maintains a friendship with a known pirate, and excuses it by saying a skilled sailor is a valuable asset to have. Some have argued that Shimura only acts like the self-righteous leader that he claims to be when in the presence of Jin and the Shogun's bannermen. The former because he wants to set a good example, the classic case of do as I say, not as I do, while the latter is simply a matter of maintaining appearances in the presence of the Shogun's chosen samurai. This would suggest that, if circumstances were different, he'd potentially be far more accepting of Jin's actions as the ghost, or at least he'd be more willing to let them slide until the Mongols were defeated. While it would explain a lot, I don't necessarily agree with this take, because that would hinge on Shimura being flexible in his tactics and overarching strategy, which he has shown not to be. It also still makes him out to be a massive hypocrite, picking and choosing when he can be an honorable samurai, while demanding that Jin be one all the time. For the record, I don't think Shimura is putting on an act. I think he genuinely believes that he's being true to the samurai code, just that he's ignorant, or perhaps more accurately, blind to the truth that Jin and the others can now see. After this scene, Jin will leave the tower and we're free to continue with the next stage of the quest, though we have the option of speaking with some of our companions first, some of whom offer their support for an alternative means of defeating the Mongols, one that doesn't involve Lord Shimura throwing away countless lives. Once we're ready, we meet with Yuna by the castle wall and we observe the bridge across the falls, being repaired by some of the men while under constant Mongol arrow fire, Lord Shimura determined to launch another assault the following morning. Jin will ask Yuna to gather the others and collect as much wolfsbane as possible, with plans to sneak across to the Mongol side of the bridge and poison their drinks. Just as Lord Shimura is determined with his plan, Jin is determined to make sure it doesn't happen, even at the risk of his uncle finding out. It's then that Yuna gives Jin a gift, a final gift from Taka. After a brief cut, we're jumped forward in time to the dead of night, where we find Yuna giving all the wolfsbane she and the others could find to Jin, who stands adorned in Taka's final gift, the ghost armor. Of course, it's only the rank 1 version. The version seen on the box art and in all the promotional material isn't available until rank 3. Regardless, getting this armor can be seen as a momentous occasion in the eyes of the player, especially if you've been waiting in anticipation for the arrival of said armor since the beginning, and could signal a marked change in your playstyle. With everything set, we begin to make our way across the bridge, doing so via grapple points and narrow makeshift walkways. Once across, we continue to climb along the cliff face before reaching the Mongol-held portion of the castle itself. We're then tasked with stealthily climbing one of the towers, taking down any Mongols in our path until we get a view of the entire compound, making sure not to get caught along the way. Once we get high enough, we survey the area and make a plan of attack. The Mongols are preparing a feast. With that in mind, Jin plans to poison the fermented milk, the arag, which should in theory take down all the Mongols without Jin's intervention beyond that. Matters are slightly complicated by the presence of Ryuzo, though Khoten Khan is nowhere to be found. We start sneaking along a garden path, then through a cluster of Mongol tents, killing any that might get in our way before reaching the main camp area where the arag is. There are 2 milk sacs that we need to poison, and doing so is no simple task. Both are in plain view from multiple angles and will require that you make full use of your ghost arsenal, or get lucky with some well-placed assassinations that grab all the Mongols' attention for just long enough. Once that's done, all we have to do is sit and wait. We're then treated to a cutscene where we see the poison do its work, and all the Mongols drop dead or to the brink of death, coughing up blood and suffering. It's a scene that I find somewhat disturbing. The Mongols have committed many crimes and will commit many more before this story is finished and deserve some amount of suffering, but even I have to admit that I don't think they deserve such a gruesome fate. Even Jin, as he emerges from his hiding place, will show some visible disgust at the results despite achieving what he set out to do. Nevertheless, we push on to the main keep, where Khotin Khan should still be languishing, walking through the carnage wrought by the poison, killing any Mongols still alive, albeit barely, as we proceed, which I honestly consider to be the merciful option over leaving them to die slowly and in agony. Entering the main keep, we find Ryuzo and no one else, the Khan having rode north, leaving Ryuzo behind to take Jin's head. Jin's more than ready and willing for the expected kerfuffle, but Ryuzo wants no part in it. Instead, he attempts to regain Jin's trust, offering to switch sides again at the 11th hour, suggesting that Jin claim he was his spy, sent to gain the Khan's trust. I really don't know what Ryuzo expects to gain from trying this, apart from saving his own head. He'll claim that it's because he's lost everything, except Jin, his oldest friend, but honestly I think it's just because he's that incredibly stupid. He tried to kill Jin once, then served directly alongside the Khan, and helped him capture Jin, which led to Taka getting murdered, which makes him, albeit indirectly, complicit with his death. Also, let's not forget that he burned an innocent peasant alive on the Khan's orders, and while all the above was happening, his Straw Hats were working alongside the Mongol invaders in committing, by today's standards, literal war crimes against the people of Tsushima. Now that the game is up, he expects Jin to just forgive and forget like none of the above happened, and attempts to use their past friendship to emotionally disarm Jin and weasel his way out of his deserved punishment. Call it what you will, but to my eyes, this is utter stupidity born out of a desperate desire to not lose one's head. Thankfully, Jin sees past Ryuzo's bullshit, but in honor of their past friendship, does offer him the chance to surrender and answer for what he's done. He'll ask that he does this for both their sakes, though I'm not entirely sure what he means by that. It could simply be that Jin doesn't want to kill Ryuzo, his oldest friend, or that perhaps by surrendering there may be a chance that he could somehow avoid execution. Ryuzo, however, refuses this offer, perhaps knowing, along with us, the inevitable outcome of such an action, that Lord Shimura won't let him leave Castle Shimura alive. With that, he draws his blade, and the two friends prepare to duel one last time. This duel is much the same as the last one against Ryuzo at Castle Canada in how it functions, though by now you'll be much better versed in fighting Ronin, so you may be more inclined to take risks. The setting is also not nearly as picturesque as the last one, though I think this is meant to highlight the changes Jin has undergone as a person since they last fought. Even at night, Castle Canada is still bright and colorful. The main keep of Castle Shimura, by comparison, is very dark and moody, perhaps to underscore the same darkness that has grown within Jin in the time that has passed, which is further supported by the venom that seems to seep from Jin's words as they fight. Eventually, we whittle Ryuzo down to the brink of death, where he falls to his knees. Ryuzo will then say please, though whether he's asking for mercy or a coup de grace is unclear. Regardless, Jin will then draw his tanto and bring an end to Ryuzo the Straw Hat.
Goodbye, Ryuzo.
It's at this point that Yuna, followed by Lord Shimura and the rest of the samurai, stroll across the bridge and bear witness to the carnage wrought by the poison. Jin attempts to move things along without fuss, informing Shimura that Khotin Khan has marched north, but dear old uncle is not about to let his actions slide. After some back and forth, where Jin bluntly states that his way won't save their people, Lord Shimura quietly states that the shogun will want a head for what happened, suggesting in a roundabout way that it would be Jin's, though I find it incredibly hard to believe that the shogun would actually give a shit. Despite their rampant romanticism, starting in the 20th century and even continuing to this day, the samurai were more than capable of being the exact opposite of what was expected of them. Despite the code of Bushido, study of Kobudo and Budo, or traditional Japanese martial arts, suggests that the samurai were just as practical as any other warriors, and wouldn't limit themselves for the sake of honor and tradition, especially when going up against an enemy capable of world-altering genocide. I appreciate that it's meant to hammer home particular plot points and narrative beats, and the shogun's later reason for wanting Jin's head in lieu of this makes sense, but it still feels forced, as Lord Shimura sort of jumps to the conclusion that Jin will be executed despite the circumstances. Shimura will then slip into his duplicitous nature and demand that Jin renounce the ghost and blame Yuna for what happened. His legacy and succession are at stake, and he doesn't care who takes the fall, so long as it isn't Jin. After a brief pause, however, Jin shatters his uncle's hopes by declaring that he will not be his son, that he is the ghost, refusing to bow to his whims and surrender Yuna for a crime she didn't commit. As Oga's samurai move in to arrest him, Jin gives Yuna his sword and tells her to head north and find the Khan, while Shimura, holding back tears, throws the declaration of his adoption of Jin into a nearby fire, forever severing all familial bonds they previously shared. We then jump to Jin in his cell as we watch him pass the time while awaiting the Shogun's judgment. When we regain control, we see Kenji arrive and speak with the samurai guarding him.
He's not going anywhere.
Kenji somehow convinces the samurai to take a break from guarding Jin, then opens the cell and tells Jin to run. Jin is initially hesitant, still hopeful that he can regain his uncle's trust, but Kenji tells him that hope has long since sailed, for the order to ship him to the mainland has just come through. He then adds that Yuna needs him, that she's up north in Kamiyagata tracking the Khan across its frozen wastes, and that she still has his sword. With this, Jin makes his peace with reality, then tells Kenji to find the others, Masako, Norio, and Ishikawa, and have them gather at Omi village, where they are to wait for him and Yuna to open the way for them to head north. From there we begin our escape, while Kenji distracts the men outside long enough for us to do that, making ample use of rooftops and ropes to avoid the samurai on the ground. As we do, we can overhear conversations being had among the samurai, where they sing Lord Shimura's praises while cursing Jin in the same breath. We eventually slip through a hole in a wall and catch sight of the stables, as well as our horse. It's also at this very moment that the garrison discovers that Jin has escaped, sending everyone into a tizzy and making things just that more precarious. We eventually reach our horse, but just as we mount up and look to make our escape, we're spotted, and our faithful steed takes an arrow in the flank. Jin manages to get up to a gallop and make it out of the castle, but not before our horse takes another arrow in the same area. Nevertheless, we push northwards, towards the town of Keen and its sacred tree, where Kenji tells us Yuna will be waiting. We're then shown some tracking shots, as the exertion of their escape and the wounds inflicted begin to take their toll on our horse, just as we enter a burning wasteland, no doubt left by the rampaging Mongols. Eventually our steed can't take any more and collapses to the ground, throwing Jin from his saddle. Despite the inevitable, Jin doesn't leave the horse behind, instead staying by its side as it slowly succumbs to its wounds. So ends Act 2, with Act 3, unlike the other two, heralded with its own title screen and one simple objective: kill the Khan. As Act 3 begins, we find Jin kneeling beside the grave of his loyal companion, before continuing down the road towards Keen. Everywhere we look are scenes of utter destruction, and it isn't long before we come across the charred remains of innocents slaughtered and burned by the Mongols, no doubt taking revenge for the fall of Castle Shimura. Keen itself hasn't fared much better, the entire village laid to waste and the sacred tree destroyed, with Mongols crawling everywhere. Still without our weapons, all we can do is sneak around and hide as we try to reach the sacred tree, in the hopes that Yuna will still be there, though that would seem incredibly unlikely. We eventually reach the sacred tree, only to find the corpses of villagers, brutally slaughtered by the Mongols. Yuna thankfully isn't among them, so we press on down the road heading out of the village and towards a bridge. As we head in that direction, we come across bodies along the way, with lots of blood but no noticeable wounds. Eventually we come across one last body, and it's here that Jin discovers the cruel truth. The Mongols have learned how to make his poison and have begun using it on the people of Tsushima. It's at this point the Mongols discover him and Jin is struck in the back with an arrow, laced with that very poison. As we attempt to escape, Jin's vision becomes blurred and wobbly and he begins to vomit blood. We don't make it very far before Jin collapses on the bridge, but just as things begin to look real grim, we hear a familiar voice.
Come on! You stupid horse!
The screen fades to white, and when we return, we find Yuna kneeling over Jin as he slowly wakes up, Yuna having taken him to an abandoned Clan Kikuchi fort. They agree that the only way things will end is with the death of Khotan Khan, especially now that the Mongols have learned how to make Jin's poison, though this does beg the question as to how they figured it out, a question that is never answered. Once we're ready and have our gear back, we meet Yuna at a watchtower which we climb to get a lay of the land, with Yuna telling us to look towards the mountain. We do this and spot Jogaku's pagoda, a defensible temple nestled in Kamiyagata's bamboo forests and in striking distance of the Khan's current base of operations, the town of Port Izumi. The only problem is that the Mongols have it. No biggie, it's not like we don't have experience dislodging them from fortified positions or anything. The attack happens in 3 stages. First, we need to clear a fishing village where the Mongols have prisoners. Second, we need to draw out the Mongols from their forward position onto the frozen lake, using the signal fireworks to draw them out, then use their explosives against them. And third, we need to sneak onto the temple grounds themselves and defeat the commanding Mongol and his retinue, freeing some priests in the process. With that done, the pagoda is ours, and we can begin to plan for the next phase of our operations. Out of all the acts, Act 3 is by far the most straightforward out of all of them. Instead of being inundated with multiple simultaneous objectives, our final push against the Khan goes from beat to beat in sequential order. Some may dislike this sudden oversimplification of what has been a multi-layered story for most of its runtime, but I think it's meant to highlight the simple truth of the matter at hand. The Khan must die. Nothing overly complicated about that. Act 3 is also the shortest of the 3 acts, again thanks in large part due to its straightforward nature. While there's no dip in the writing quality that I can notice, given how quickly things move along, it can feel a bit rushed, especially if you do like I did on my second run where I just mainlined the main story and did nothing else. There is a reason for this, one that we'll discover later when we scout Port Izumi, but that won't happen until at least midway through the act. The next step is to get our friends, who should be gathered at Omi by now, across the mountains and into Kamiyagata. They can do this by passing through Fort Kamino Dake. Unfortunately, and totally unsurprising to anyone by now, the Mongols have it. We'll need help, and to that end, Yuna knows some hunters camped on Mount Sago, led by a man named Takashi, who will do anything that Yuna asks, though she makes it clear that he isn't a friend. While Jin does that, Yuna will head south and relay with their friends, bring them to attack the fort from the south, while Jin and the hunters strike from the north. We find Takashi and his hunters on Mount Sago, and after a brief negotiation, wherein Jin agrees to let them stay at the fort until spring, Takashi agrees to help drive the Mongols out. Also in this conversation, and the following surveillance of the fort, we learn that Takashi may be more than a little infatuated with Yuna. Sometime later, we meet up with Takashi and his men just outside the fort, where we scale some cliffs to sneak our way inside and catch the Mongols by surprise. After we clear out the northern section of the fort, we proceed towards the southern half, where we catch sight of our friends making an explosive entrance. Seeing this, we take control of the fort's central section before finally pushing on to the south, where we link up with our friends and notice that some of Yarikawa's warriors have joined them. Together we clear out the rest of the Mongols before we can finally take a breath and relax. Once we're finished, Jin will have a quick word with Yuna. Unbeknownst to us, though not to Jin, Takashi's hunters are in reality bandits. Bandits whom Yuna fell in with a long time ago when she and Taka were living their nomadic lifestyle. Jin is concerned that he's leaving the fort in the hands of bandits who may use it as a base to raid refugees fleeing south, but Yuna assures him that nothing of the sort will happen, for Takashi knows what she'll do to him if he does.
I think he's been looking forward to seeing you.
He's seen me. We can go now.
When we're ready, we can return to Jogaku and speak with Yuna once more. From there we make for Port Izumi to scout its defenses and pinpoint where Khoten Khan may be hiding. The Khan has situated himself there as it's the perfect jumping off point to invade the mainland with what remains of his forces. From a nearby graveyard, we head for a Mongol-controlled lighthouse where we can get a better view of the town. Along the way, we pass through a small field of wolfsbane, which the Mongols have been picking to make more of Jin's poison. Upon reaching the lighthouse, we find dozens of barrels full of wolfsbane. Jin deduces that the Khan has had his men gather it so the poison can be used on the mainland. With that in mind, it becomes immediately imperative that the Khan doesn't leave Tsushima, no matter the cost. This is the reason I alluded to earlier as to why Act 3 feels so quick, for the situation at hand requires that our band of heroes move just as quickly. Khoten Khan isn't going to sit around and faff about. It's on Jin and Co to move with him and match his pace, for the Khan has already shown that he intends to sail for the mainland as soon as possible. At the top of the tower, we get a perfect view of Port Izumi where we can plan our attack. During our surveillance, we'll notice the seagulls circling around the harbor. If you live or have lived on any coastline, you'll automatically know that signifies the approach of a storm, the seagulls heading inland in search of shelter. With this in mind, Jin and Yuna realize the Khan will have to shelter his fleet in the bay, providing them the perfect window of opportunity in which to strike and take him down. However, the storm won't last forever, and once it passes, Khoten will have a clear path to the mainland. To that end, they head back to Jogaku and begin final preparations. Back at Jogaku, Yuna informs us that Kenji has sourced some huachas to steal, with Yuna preparing to head out and do just that. Even with greater firepower, however, they still need more men. Now, where can they get more men, perhaps? Why, good old Uncle Shimura, of course. Yuna is immediately against the plan, with good reason, but Jin sees no other option, reckoning that despite all that's happened, Lord Shimura will help them regardless, since he obviously wants the Khan dead as well. Of course, Jin can't just stroll up to Castle Shimura and expect a warm welcome, so he plans to sneak in and out without being seen, leaving a message for his uncle to find in his quarters, relaying everything that he knows and plans to do. Assuming he reads it, of course. Before we set off for Castle Shimura, Yuna has something for us. Since we lost our last horse, we've been forced to ride a scrawny nag that Yuna seems to have just pulled out of some medieval Japanese dumpster. With a long ride to Castle Shimura ahead of us, it seems only right that we ride a more fitting and perhaps more capable steed. To that end, we get a repeat of a moment from the prologue, where we get to choose which color of haunts we'd like, as well as a name. My recommendation would be to roll with the black horse and the name Kage, meaning shadow, if you didn't with your last horse, to better match the ghost image and mystique. With that done, we head for Castle Shimura. Upon arrival at the base of the cliffs it sits upon, we're treated to a flashback with young Jin and Lord Shimura, one that I find particularly random and unsure as to its significance beyond what we already know. We then jump back to the present to the dead of night, where we can begin climbing the cliffs following a path that, according to Jin, only he knew about. You may have a brief moment of panic when you come across a lone fisherman at the start of the path, but if you get close to him, he'll just simply warn Jin that the samurai are watching for him, then go about his business. Once we reach the top, we can begin to sneak through the castle grounds, working our way back to the main keep, where Lord Shimura resides. As you might expect, it functions exactly the same as when we made our escape at the end of Act 2. We can't attack any of the guards or be caught. After carefully traversing an unfamiliar area of the castle, we reach the same bridge we used to cross during the battle by wading downriver, before following the same path along the cliffs and reaching the heart of the castle. We can then proceed to follow the exact same garden path, while Lord Shimura gives a speech to the assembled samurai. We enter the main keep just as Lord Shimura finishes his speech and enters as well, and we more or less follow the same path to his quarters near the top. All the while, Lord Shimura will curse Jin's name, even taking umbrage at it being mentioned in his presence. As we follow Lord Shimura, we get a glimpse of a man that, despite the rousing speech, appears and sounds rather defeated. Let's not forget, by defying him, Jin didn't just disobey his Jito and his uncle, he practically ruined all of his plans, his hopes of cementing the future of Clan Shimura, as well as Jin's. This will become far more pronounced and put center stage in the epilogue, but it's here that I want to discuss a theme within the overarching narrative that's present throughout the main story and all of the companion questlines, but isn't really discussed. That of legacy. Throughout the main story and in the companion questlines, Jin and his friends are constantly confronted by the impact of their past and present decisions, and how they've resonated, whether within themselves, the people or island of Tsushima, or even both. It particularly defines Jin's relationship with Lord Shimura, and while it doesn't become particularly apparent until Act 2, some light is shed on it in Act 1 during Koten's conversations with the captive Shimura in Castle Canada, with even the Khan referring to Jin directly as Shimura's legacy in what initially sounds like just an offhand observation. It's then thrust into the spotlight when Shimura informs Jin of his intentions to officially adopt him as his son. This decision by Lord Shimura isn't just to fulfill the requirements of securing his succession, but also to fulfill his legacy. He wanted Jin to be the embodiment of everything he believed, to ensure that his legacy lived on. By becoming the ghost, Jin has ruined that legacy irrevocably. No matter what he does from this point forward, Lord Shimura will now always be remembered as the man whose nephew became the antithesis of what it means to be samurai. The companion side quests are much the same, and can be viewed as a more gradual exposure to the idea over the respective plot lines when compared to the somewhat more direct approach of the main story. Through them, we also get a far more broad look at the concept of legacy as reflected by the varying situations we find ourselves in. In Ishikawa's story, we see an attempt to repair a legacy that has already been tarnished, thanks to preceding events, when a prior student of his led a rebellion against Clan Nagao, and he was forced to peacefully resign. He had hoped to reforge his legacy and repair his reputation by way of Tomoe, but his unforgiving nature as a sensei pushed her to turn against him and, in a repeat of the past, used what he taught her maliciously, thus laying the groundwork for when and how we find him. Other stories deal with the lasting impact of past decisions and the legacy they create, warranted or otherwise, such as Lady Masako's, who discovers that it was her older sister Hana, whom she previously believed was dead, who masterminded the fall of Clan Adachi. According to Hana, Masako stole the hand of Lord Harinobu many years earlier after an incident with bandits. To ease her heartache, Masako arranged her marriage to a supposedly honorable retainer of Clan Kikuchi, but the retainer turned out to be a drunk and abusive piece of shit. For this, she formed a conspiracy against Masako, which culminated in the massacre of her family while Lord Harinobu was being turned into samurai brisket. All thanks to decisions Masako made in the past, decisions that, it could be argued, were made with the best of intentions under the given circumstances. Yuna's story, which we've already discussed, falls under this category as well, particularly when it comes to Ichi, the fellow slave who helped them escape but was recaptured in the process and thus holds a long-standing grudge against her as a result, despite Yuna still considering her as a friend. In Norio's story, we get an exploration of how one might attempt to live up to one's legacy and the burden it can create as a result. Norio's older brother Enjo, as mentioned previously, was a renowned warrior monk, known as the Guardian of Cedar Temple, and Norio feels burdened by the need to live up to his legacy, especially after he's presumed killed by the Mongols. Things take a dark turn when it's discovered that Enjo is alive, but has been subjected to the worst cruelties by the Mongols before succumbing to them. Norio, blinded by revenge and hatred, takes his vengeance out on the Mongol warlord responsible by burning him alive, before feeling immediate regret over his actions, for they stand in stark contention with his brother's legacy, ultimately, at Jin's insistence, resolving to do better in honor of it. Finally, in Kenji's story, we see an attempt to forge a lasting and positive legacy, in his case by trying to help others, though being that it's Kenji we're talking about, it doesn't exactly go according to plan, and not always without an ulterior motive, usually involving profit and cheating bad guys. Bad guys with sharp swords.
My lord, I'm an idiot.
It's a story that gets somewhat of an extension in the Iki Island DLC and shows another side of Kenji that isn't the swindler that he is, which Jin is quick to pick up on and encourage, minus the skullduggery and deception. As we can see, the idea of legacy is everywhere in Ghost of Tsushima and asks an interesting question. How do you want to be remembered? What do you want people to say or think when they hear your name? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? Does it ultimately even matter? This is where Jin's story, for me, gets most interesting, for it's those questions he's constantly grappling with, from about the midpoint of Act 2 right until the very end of the epilogue. It goes hand in hand nicely with the idea of sacrificing everything you know to save your people, or more broadly, to do the right thing, for it's through this sacrifice that Jin forges his legacy, even at the cost of being vilified for it. It's a reality that, as we climb Castle Shimura's main keep, that he's come to accept and is willing to live with, exemplified by the words in his letter to his uncle, which Lord Shimura finds just as he makes his exit from the castle.
Uncle, forgive me for not facing you in person. The Khan's fleet has gathered at Port Izumi. His ships are loaded with poison that will devastate the Shogun's army. But when the next storm arrives, I plan to kill the Khan and sink his fleet. I ask that you join me. I hope we can meet again. If not as father and son, then as warriors who have walked different paths. Whatever you believe I've become, I will always be your family.
With that done, all there is to do now is return to Jogaku and make final preparations before facing off with Koten, and hope that Lord Shimura comes to our aid. We can kickstart the endgame by speaking to Yuna, but before you do that, you may want to take some time and complete any side quests and activities. With that said, let's talk about side quests for a bit, since I've put them off long enough. Side quests in Ghost of Tsushima are split into two categories: Tales of Tsushima and Mythic Tales. Standard tales can then be divided into two subcategories, between the more involved quest lines of our companions, and standard side quests that can be found while exploring the open world, either by stumbling upon them or by speaking to certain NPCs, who can also be found while wandering the world or after you liberate a location from the Mongols. The companion tales we've already discussed. As for the mythic tales, they share many of the same qualities, being quite involved and lengthy by comparison to the vast majority of side quests, often necessitating you cover vast distances across Tsushima to complete their objectives. The rewards for the mythic tales are also quite substantial and well worth the sizable legwork required to get them, these rewards being either unique armor with just as unique buffs tailored to particular playstyles, or special combat techniques that require either a resource or the use of resolve to execute. Each of them also gets a unique and excellently done cutscene at the beginning, while a musician named Yamato recounts the tale in question, before sending Jin on his way to complete it, Jin returning to the musician once he's found whatever the reward is at the end, with most of these tales requiring he wear the given armor or use the given combat technique in a combat encounter. As side quests, though they're only one-offs of each legendary tale, their quality is on par with that of the companion quests, showing a considerable amount of depth, as well as requiring a considerable amount of effort on the part of the player. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the standard side quests, which are by far the weakest aspect of the game narratively. The main issue is that most of them are incredibly simple and don't offer much in the way of narrative depth. Of course, not every quest has to have the depth of one from The Witcher 3 or Fallout New Vegas, but the fact that most of them revolve around talk to this quest giver, go to this location, investigate said location, maybe kill some baddies, return to quest giver if they haven't unalived themselves, which is a strangely common occurrence in these quests, the end, they don't exactly make for exhilarating storytelling, with only slight variations on this formula from quest to quest. Now, it must be said, not all fall into this quickly tired formula, and there are a few that are worthy of some recognition, if only because they stand out amongst the boring rest. In The Other Side of Honor, Jin finds a house being maintained by a group of women who are under the protection of one Lord Jinroku, a legendary samurai, which confuses Jin since all the samurai, save for him and Lord Shimura, died on Komoda Beach. Sure enough, we meet this Lord Jinroku, and after speaking with him and a brief investigation of the stables, we discover that he's just some schmuck that's masquerading as a samurai. We return to the house to confront him, but discover he's gone. Going after him, we catch up with him, challenge him to a duel that lasts all of 2 seconds, and force Jinroku to confess the truth. Jin then lets him go on the condition that he never does it again. Quest over, right? Not quite, for we return to the house to inform the women of the truth, only to find out that they knew all along that Jinroku was just pretending, but allowed it since he wasn't causing any trouble. Not the most exciting quest to be sure, but one with a clever twist that caught me by surprise with some flexing of comedic muscles that doesn't involve Kenji. Another, far darker quest can be found in Kamiagata at Sago Mill. Called Hidden in Snow, Jin will arrive at the mill to find its denizens wary of his presence, resulting from past experiences with Mongols and bandits, but their leader, a man named Sota, will state that most of the people died due to starvation and disease. Jin is immediately suspicious, given Sota and the others' demeanors, as well as the absence of any women, and will proceed to investigate. He encounters another peasant who shares his suspicions and leads him to another area of the village where we discover numerous bodies. Interestingly, these men were killed with weapons, contrary to Sota's claim of starvation and disease. We also find a set of footprints and begin to follow them, which end up leading us to a farm held by the Mongols who are keeping prisoners there. Once we defeat the Mongols and free them, we discover that the prisoners in question are the women of Sago Mill. According to them, the remaining men of Sago Mill essentially allowed the Mongols to take them without so much as a protest in return for their lives, with the corpses of those slain being the few men who actually resisted. The women choose to remain at the farm, having no desire to return to the men who so easily let them be taken. We return to Sago Mill, where Jin will demand that the men gather and face him directly. He berates them for their actions and condemns them all to death, but Sota quickly takes all the blame and begs that the others be spared. It's here that you're presented with a choice. Either kill them all, or just Sota. If you just kill Sota, the others will flee, with Jin viciously ordering them to never return lest they end up like Sota. The peasant who helped us earlier will arrive on the scene and converse with Jin for a bit, before the quest is brought to a close. These 2 side quests are perfect examples of what could have been possible outside the more substantial companion tales and mythic tales, but unfortunately they're exceptions rather than the rule. Most of the standard side quests lack this amount of depth and are very basic in their premise. I'd say that, at the risk of arousing controversy, they're about as deep as side quests in Skyrim and Fallout 4, but then that might be giving those games as side quests too much credit, for Ghost's side quests, even at their most basic, have some amount of effort put into them, even if only a little more. This also isn't helped by the rather stagnant cutscenes, though granted this is an issue that also plagues the companion tales, mythic tales, and the main story. Many of the cutscenes in this game largely involve Jin and another character just standing there and talking, with little in the way of bodily expression. On top of this, especially in the standard side quests, many of them are done in engine, where it appears as if the imaginary cameraman is at a distance and the only indicator of what the characters are feeling is intimated through their tone, along with maybe a slight hint in body language. This decision to stage many scenes this way hurts them and saps them of emotional resonance. A prime example can be found during Masako's story when we confront a woman named Mai, a former Clan Adachi servant whose name is on the list of conspirators we find back in Act 1. Turns out Mai and Masako had been secret lovers, until the latter had the former banished for theft, though Masako did this to save Mai from being flogged on Lord Harinobu's orders. The story of these two is quite moving given the circumstances, but the scenes themselves are so rigid that, if it weren't for the expertly written and performed dialogue and amazing score, these scenes would be devoid of any emotional resonance. I'm not quite sure as to why Sucker Punch went in this direction. Perhaps they wanted to put a greater focus on the dialogue, or that the more rigid scenes stood out better against the world itself, which, let's be honest with ourselves, is a work of art all on its own. Whatever the reason, it's clear that Sucker Punch heard these criticisms and took them to heart, for cutscenes in the Iki Island DLC are considerably better, with greater bodily expression by characters, as well as more interesting camera perspectives. Once we're ready, we can speak to Yuna, whom Jin asked to tell the others that they plan to attack at dawn. From here, we can speak to our companions before the big game, with their dialogue depending on whether you've completed their questlines or not. In any event, all of them are willing and prepared to fight alongside Jin to defeat the Khan for good. Once we've done that, we speak to Yuna again, and the two share a rather tender moment, with there being a strong suggestion that, after everything they've been through, there's a sense of romantic attraction between them. There is no romance scene, only that this scene ends with the two of them sitting together for a while, enjoying each other's company. This has led to one of the stranger criticisms of this game's story that I can't quite wrap my head around: the lack of a true romance between Jin and Yuna. In the past, I've stated that romance can enhance a story if it's done well, but it isn't always necessary. Yet for some reason, some people are bewildered by the fact that there isn't a romance between Jin and Yuna, or that there's at the very least a love scene between them, you cheeky devils, despite the fact that it's not until this very scene at the 11th hour that there's any indication that the two may be romantically interested in one another. Truth be told, neither Jin or Yuna have probably had time to even entertain such a notion until now, and only because they're about to jump headfirst into an all-or-nothing crucible, one they may not walk away from. What this scene says to me is that there's definitely some sort of romantic interest between them, and with there being strong indicators of a sequel, it could also serve as a suggestion that it's an aspect of both their characters that the writers would like to explore in the future. There just wasn't any room for it in the more personal story of Jin that they were trying to tell in this game. From here, we jump forward to the next day to just outside Port Izumi as the expected storm rages, where Jin and the gang go over the plan one last time before kicking things off. At Yuna's signal, Kenji with the Hwachas will rain fire down on the Mongol fleet. In response, the Mongols will no doubt attempt to charge his position, passing through a small suburb to get there, at which point Jin and the others will ambush and cut them down. There is one caveat to this whole plan. Lord Shimura and his army is nowhere to be seen. Nevertheless, they have to push on. As Jin points out, the storm isn't waiting, so neither are they. With that, Yuna fires a signal arrow, the Hwachas open fire on the Mongol fleet, and the final battle for Tsushima begins. This first phase is pretty straightforward. You'll face off against waves of Mongol enemies, progressively pushing them out of the suburb until they're forced to withdraw and regroup. Not wanting to give them a chance, we link up with Norio, who's leading the rest of our forces into position to strike at Port Izumi itself. For this phase, the others plan to distract the Mongols just long enough for Jin to sneak inside the town. They risk being overwhelmed, but at this point, who cares? No matter what happens, the Khan has to die, and that can only happen if Jin reaches him. We do this by traipsing along a frozen river that follows a gorge that cuts through the town and empties out into the sea. Once inside, we search for a vantage point where we can pinpoint Khotun's location, doing so at a watchtower near the heart of the town, taking down any Mongols that get in our way. Once we climb the tower, we're treated to a cutscene. As expected, per our earlier reconnaissance, we spot the Khan at the Harbor Master's estate, but before we can proceed, we hear a distant horn.
Tsushima! No mercy!
Lord Shimura and his samurai have arrived, tipping the scales in the Japanese's favor. From here, we proceed to the estate, methodically taking down any Mongol patrols that get in our way, while Lord Shimura's forces take the battle into the town itself, putting the Mongols on the back foot. Eventually, we reach the gates to the estate and step inside, where we find the Khan waiting for us, enjoying some arag. The Khan will begin with some self-indulgent speech, reminding Jin that he had offered peace, but he and Lord Shimura instead chose to fight, leading to all the death and destruction we've seen throughout the story, and that the people of mainland Japan will suffer as a result, holding a vial of Jin's poison. Something seems off about this little speech from Khotun, though I can't exactly pinpoint what, beyond that it feels like he's unable to accept that he's found himself in this situation. His army backed into a corner, his fleet on fire, and his plans for invading mainland Japan fading around him, all while he faces down perhaps the only man he truly fears, even if he doesn't show it. He's prided himself on understanding his enemy, knowing his every possible move. Jin, however, has gone against this grain, and so all he can muster in response is to pin the blame for the death and destruction on Tsushima on his and his uncle's refusal to surrender, which bears some truth, but even then it's a stretch. It could be argued that it seems out of character, but Khotun does maintain an air of certainty about him, even if it is just a mask against his true emotions. And let's face it, it's become something of a trope for otherwise stoic villains to lose all sense of control and go bananas when things start to fall apart for them, so yeah, there's that. Jin obviously is not about to let Koten leave Tsushima and the two begin their duel in earnest. You may initially think that it'll just be a more grandiose rehash of the first duel with the Khan back on the bridge at Castle Canada, only to be slapped into realizing that won't be the case. At Castle Canada, Koten's movesets were rather simple, sharing those with the higher level polearm wielding Mongol enemies you encounter throughout the game, with only occasional hints at him being capable of more complex moves and attacks. This can be explained as the Khan merely toying with an exhausted and perhaps mentally unfocused Jin, like a cat would with a mouse, where he's not taking this duel all that seriously. Now at Port Izumi, aware that he can't afford to be lax or taking now much stronger Jin for granted, Koten is bringing out all the stops this time, with movesets similar to that of Mongol brutes, but with much greater fluidity and speed, with nearly all of his attacks being unblockable, especially his wide sweeps and arcing chopping blows. As a result, you'll spend much of this fight on the back foot, dodging and dodge rolling while waiting for opportunities to take a few swings at him to work down his stagger meter and open him up to a flurry of attacks. But even these openings can be deceptive since the Khan can quickly parry and block these attacks before launching one of his own sweeping strikes that will send you flying and take a nice chunk out of your health. In short, don't be overly aggressive. Be patient, spam the dodge button, then jump on every possible opening, but be prepared to quickly adjust and go back on the defensive without much warning. Eventually, once you whittle his health down enough, a wounded Koten staggers backwards, his back to Jin. Just as Jin is about to land the killing blow, however, the Khan will swing round and throw some of the poison at his face before skulking back to his ship, leaving his men to take care of the rest. From here, we fight our way to the Khan ship, taking down another swarm of enemies along the way. Once on the ship, we're confronted by the Khan and yet more of his men, and this is where this final showdown gets somewhat interesting. Initially, we fight just more of his men, before Koten eventually joins in himself and fights alongside them, still using the same wide sweeping strikes as from before. Eventually, when we kill all of his men and deal enough damage to him, the next phase starts, with more Mongols joining the fray, this time with missile troops that you can't reach directly and thus have to take down from range, all while fighting the Khan and his other men up close. After dealing enough damage, we're prompted with a sort of quick time event where Jin chops his halberd in half, turning it into a makeshift sword, kickstarting the final phase of the engagement, which is just a repeat of the last one. Eventually the game is up for the Khan, and a wounded and exhausted Koten is forced back, dropping his sword and holding up his shield in a meek defense. We're then given a QTE, where we knock the shield out of his hands, before finally giving him what he's long deserved. The two will converse for a short bit, before Jin pulls his sword free and ends proceedings with a swift beheadment, thus ending the life of Koten Khan and the threat to Japan and Tsushima. We don't get much of a chance to bask in it, however, as the ship begins to fall apart and Jin is forced to jump overboard. We then jump forward to find his mask lying on the shore, which is found by Yuna. We then see Jin stagger ashore, about to collapse, but is caught by Yuna. Yuna gives Jin back his mask, and the two subsequently leave the beach as the camera pans away, before we jump forward again to Jin and Yuna riding back to the temple. I don't like this. More specifically, I don't like how Koten's death is handled, how quickly we just move on from it. The entire basis of the story revolves around defeating him and his army, with everything else feeding off this base, and so you would think that the game would take some time to acknowledge his death, especially after everything he's done, but instead the game just sort of goes, "Well done, good show, see you next week," like it's no big deal. I appreciate that this could be because he isn't the final boss, but given his importance to everything that has transpired, I would have expected the writers to have given the conclusion of his part in the story a lot more than what we get, especially when, if you think about it, the brilliant ending that we get afterwards wouldn't have been possible without Koten Khan being Jin's adversary and pushing him the way he did. I'm not suggesting that the Khan deserved better or a more graceful ending. In truth, I wouldn't blame Jin one bit if he took his time with killing him. I just wish that such a brilliantly written and acted villain who, in the context of the story, was larger than life and was the catalyst of many of its events, wasn't so quickly cast aside. Jin and Yuna dismount just outside the temple, where she informs him that Lord Shimura sent a messenger following the battle. He wants to meet with Jin on the shore of Omi Lake at the same spot where they used to spar. Jin decides to face him before declining Yuna's offer to keep him company. Shimura is his only remaining family, and he must in some way feel that he at least owes him the chance for a private conversation where they can hash things out like family without any outside influence. After Yuna briefly reminisces about Taka, and we get another sprinkling of a potential romance between them, Jin and Yuna go their separate ways, leaving us with our one final task before the end. When we arrive at the sparring ring in Omi Lake, we find that Lord Shimura hasn't arrived yet. With no other option but to wait, we sit on the dock and do just that, while Jin pulls out his flute and begins to play a tune while looking over the lake. We then jump forward an undetermined amount of time, I reckon at least a day since Jin's out of his armor, where we get yet another awkward scene transition. Like, why couldn't they have just done a rendered cutscene like they do immediately after it? This initial conversation between Jin and Shimura feels rather awkward, though I don't mean that as criticism. It's the sort of awkward that happens between two people who had a massive spat only moments before and are now trying to pretend like it didn't happen, though in this instance, neither Jin nor Shimura can do that. I mean, it's kinda why they're here. Jin immediately wants to start planning the next steps for driving the remaining Mongols from the island, but Shimura informs him that his involvement won't be necessary, because the Shogun has ordered Clan Sakai be disbanded, which in turn means that Jin is no longer a samurai. This also means that his lands and estate are forfeit, and according to Shimura, new samurai, being sent to replace the ones lost at Komoda and throughout the war, will occupy his lands and estate. To that end, Jin wishes to say goodbye to his home before he's inevitably given the boot. With that, Lord Shimura, after a long pause, will ask that Jin ride with him, officially kickstarting the final quest of the main story. Now you, dear viewer, may be asking yourself a bunch of questions about this very video and its structure. Chiefly, Adam, why are you calling this part the epilogue when it's really just the end of Act 3? The epilogue doesn't actually start until after this quest. Also, why are you giving this part its own section when it's very short by comparison to the others? Are you fucking stupid?
My lord, I am an idiot.
Well, firstly, yes, I am very stupid, but there's a reason why I've structured the end of the story this way and why I consider this final meeting with Lord Shimura to be the true start of the epilogue. With the death of Khotan Khan, there's a great sense of finality since we've achieved the main goal of the entire story. It's another reason why I don't like how Khotan's death is handled. We've achieved the ultimate aim of this endeavor and it's not given any time to truly sink in before things quickly move along. Meeting with Lord Shimura and learning the fate of Clan Sakai and everything else that follows, while yes, is still in Act 3, has the feeling of an epilogue, and it's here that certain threads are wrapped up and the story of Jin and Shimura is concluded, while remaining somewhat detached from everything else that has transpired. I'd probably feel differently if Lord Shimura had met with us directly at Jogaku Temple and asked to meet Jin at Omi Lake instead of sending a messenger, as there would be a sense of continuity from one moment to the next, but as it stands, by not doing it this way, there's a degree of separation, where the story reaches its conclusion with Khotan's death, and meeting Lord Shimura is where everything else is resolved, just like in an epilogue. It's also why I feel it should get its own section, along with the fact that it has one of the most beautifully composed and emotionally charged endings to a video game I've ever played, and I want to give it its own space to showcase this. But first, we need to get to that ending, and ride with Lord Shimura through Sakai lands one last time. The first half of this ride entails Shimura ruefully wishing that they could continue to face the remaining Mongol threat as father and son, to which Jin awkwardly suggests that he could simply remarry and start a new family, though Shimura doesn't give a definitive response to this. We then come across a merchant in Omi village, his cart having gotten stuck in the mud. Jin and Shimura will help him push his cart free, but before we do, Jin will ask where he's taking so many supplies, and we learn just how much of an impact the ghost has had on the people of Tsushima. According to the merchant, the ghost is forming an army to invade the Mongol steppe and destroy them, as revenge for what they did to Tsushima. This army is gathering in Jogaku, and the merchant is bringing everything he can to supply them and their journey. This comes as shocking and rather uncomfortable news to Jin, and after they help the merchant and send him on his way, he's quick to make clear that he has no idea what the merchant is talking about, but Shimura is just as quick to tell him not here, and they continue their ride. This is where the conversation turns serious. Jin will insist that he doesn't have an army, but according to Shimura, more people join his cause with every passing day. Naturally, the Shogun and Shimura are concerned. When the new clans arrive, will the people bow to the samurai as they've always done, or will they stand in defiance of them just as Jin did at Castle Shimura? Jin will then insist that they will listen to him since they're supposedly loyal to him, but Shimura will argue that because he disobeyed him at Castle Shimura, he taught the people of Tsushima to disobey their leaders, so what reason do they have to obey Jin if he orders them to disband? It's an interesting thought process by Shimura, but it's one that's made without any discernible evidence, only a gut assumption based on a singular world view. Because of his actions, Jin inadvertently created a movement that's loyal to him, but because those actions defied the will of their shogun and Jito, that must mean they'll disobey him too, if he were to order them to disband and go home. Feudal Japan had an extremely strict hierarchical structure, where loyalty to one's master was almost paramount, with the samurai setting the example in this regard through their code. Jin has poked more than a few holes in both of these, and these holes have begun to rip open thanks to success as the ghost and the burgeoning support it has garnered. Shimura, like most samurai, has lived his whole life via this hierarchy as well as the code and knows nothing else, and fears that Jin's actions will precipitate the collapse of their society now that the people have been emboldened to defy their leaders. What he should do is direct Jin to order this ghost army, which I must add we never see in the postgame, not at least that I can recall, and order them to disband. If it does, awesome, Shimura has nothing to worry about. If they don't, then it proves that he was right to be concerned and admonish Jin for it. Instead, he jumps straight to the worst case possible, at least in his eyes, and admonishes Jin without even having any evidence to back it up, save for what his worldview tells him. At the end of the ride, we come to the Sakai clan cemetery, where Shimura intends for them to pay their respects to Jin's father before the land is handed over. Once they do this and briefly reminisce, Shimura informs Jin of what we all have been expecting and just waiting to hear. The Shogun has declared Jin a traitor, the ghost an outlaw, and in a cruel twist of fate, it's Shimura's job to deliver his head. Shimura makes no effort to hide his displeasure at having been ordered to do so. Back in Act 3, when we sneak into the main keep at Castle Shimura, I mentioned that he looked and sounded defeated. Here, we see a man that's completely broken, with all his hopes and dreams torn asunder, his legacy now that of failure and regret, with the final stake through his broken heart, the order to execute Jin, his would-be son. It's clear that Shimura doesn't want to kill Jin, but must, lest he defy the Shogun himself. To that end, he's brought Jin to Kazumasa's grave so that they can have one final duel, to the death. Either Jin walks away and lives on as the ghost, or Shimura will do his duty to the Shogun and deliver Jin's head. This duel isn't directly stated, but heavily inferred, especially when Shimura hands Jin a scroll and instructs him to write the last words of either Clan Sakai or Clan Shimura, an act that alludes in some degree to the custom of samurai writing death poems before committing seppuku, or ritual suicide. Why Shimura doesn't write his own and leaves it to Jin to write for both is unclear, though it could be meant to symbolize just how intertwined the two clans have become, having become in essence one and the same, and further deepening the already concrete father-son connection the two men share. The two men will then separate, and we're left to compose a haiku, playing out just like the activity we find in the open world, this one perhaps being the most scenic out of all of them. When Jin finishes reciting the poem, he'll have a brief flashback to when he was younger, when Lord Shimura tells him that he'll train him to be the strongest warrior Clan Sakai has ever known, and raise him as his own son. Oh, how things have come full circle. Jin will then indicate his readiness, and the two men will stand up, slowly approach, draw their blades, and prepare to duel one final time. Dueling Lord Shimura from a gameplay perspective is nothing revolutionary. He shares the same basic moveset as Ryuzo and the Straw Hats, with some personal moves of his own. What makes this fight among the best for me instead is everything surrounding it. The context, the stakes, the raw emotion preceding it, and that which follows. Everything that these two have endured together, within their own respective bubble nestled within the wider narrative, has been building to this and is now being unleashed in this duel. A duel neither of them want but must do for the sake of duty and honor. Eventually, once we whittle down his health, we're treated to a cutscene, where we see Lord Shimura send tumbling to the ground. He'll then rise and attempt to strike Jin, who easily slips the blow and cuts him across his abdomen. Shimura will then fall to his knees and face Jin, standing over him, and ask that he honor him with a warrior's death. And thus we reach the penultimate act of this gripping saga, where we're presented with a choice. Either honor Lord Shimura's wish and grant him an honorable death, or spare him and simply walk away, fully committing to the ghost identity. If you spare Shimura, Jin will simply stand over him, saying that he has no honor, but that he won't kill his only remaining family, even if, as Shimura puts it, he's hunted for the rest of his days. He then gives himself over to the ghost, putting on the mask and walking away, while the bewildered Shimura looks on. The camera will follow Jin for a time, before fading to white, and the credits begin to roll. If you honor Shimura's wish, Jin will kneel before him and draw his tanto, promising to make sure that his uncle will be remembered for all the good things he did. Shimura will thank him and tell him to meet him in the next life. From there, Jin gives his uncle the coup de grace before breaking down into tears and cries of sorrow, as the life slowly ebbs from Shimura's body and the camera pulls away before fading to white and the credits begin to roll. Now there's been quite a bit of debate online about which is the right ending, between the choice to either kill or spare Shimura. Naturally, there are those who feel quite strongly about the topic, especially when you consider that, in most cases where a game has multiple endings to choose from, there's ultimately a correct choice when enough evidence is presented. This is largely due to every other ending possibly not being thought out as much or simply put in to give the players choices, which is never a bad thing, but can ultimately lead to the whole discourse that these games have to endure when they come out about half-baked or nonsensical endings that may only have tenuous ties to the wider themes and concepts of the narrative. It's often why, when a game has multiple endings, that I prefer those whose endings are determined by choices made during the narrative and have a knock-on effect, and the ending presented is determined by said choices, such as Dragon Age Inquisition or The Witcher 3, instead of the arguably more artificial endings that have you choose between A, B, or C. Ghost of Tsushima, while falling into that latter category, doesn't have this problem, because the writers thought out these two choices and how they fit within the narrative's greater themes and concepts. This makes both choices, between killing or sparing Shimura, theoretically correct, and the debate becomes not which one is, but which one is more. Which way you lean, I think, will depend on how you feel about Jin's journey and growth as a character and how it contrasts with Shimura's. I've always leaned towards killing Shimura as the right way to go. Despite their differences and the opposing paths they've chosen to walk, they both still love each other like father and son, and thus it only makes sense that Jin do right by Shimura and honor his request, a sort of final act of love before their bond is finally severed. There's also an element of respect in killing Shimura. Despite his duplicitous nature, Shimura meant well in how he raised Jin and wanted him to live, a fact that's not lost on Jin. Shimura may be guilty of many things, but I would argue that being a bad father figure is not one of them. By killing him, Jin is showing that he retains much of what his uncle taught him, and giving him an honorable death is in respect of that. That said, sparing Shimura and walking away has many of its own merits. Like I said, both choices are theoretically correct. The biggest and best argument in favor of sparing him is that the whole narrative is centered around Jin becoming the ghost, shedding the ideals of the samurai code in favor of more practical and more efficient but less honorable means. Back in part 1 of Act 2, I referred to the moment when we get the ghost dance in Yarikawa as the moment Jin fully embraces his status as being the ghost. Note how I said status, because Jin himself hasn't really fully committed to the idea yet and still sees himself as an honorable samurai, one who's just bending the rules for the sake of saving his home. By refusing to honor Shimura's request for an honorable death, Jin's finally accepting that him being the ghost isn't just some status, it's really who he is now. There's no hesitation, no second guessing himself, further aided by the simple fact that, as Shimura puts it, he's going to be hunted until the end of his days. May as well embrace what he's become. There's also the argument that sparing Shimura and refusing his final request serves well as a form of punishment for the old Jito, for his stubbornness and his blatant hypocrisy, be it with regards to his relationship with Goro, for striking Jin in anger, or in trying to throw Yuna under the bus back at Castle Shimura. There's almost a ridiculous amount of irony when you view Shimura's request in that light, and you may feel that he doesn't deserve an honorable death for those reasons, even if Jin doesn't frame his reason for going that route in that way. By refusing him, you leave Shimura in perhaps more shame than he was before their duel, and thus he may be forced to think critically about everything that has led to this moment, including his own decisions, though given his stubborn nature, that's not a given. Regardless of which path we take, it's a perfect emotional cap on an excellent tale, one that left me thinking about the story and its themes for quite some time back in 2020, before we're taken to the credits, and we finally reach the true epilogue of the game. Once the credits roll, we're taken to a shack located in either Otsuna or Kubara prefectures, depending on our choice, where we find Jin wearing a unique dye on his ghost armor, the color of which is dependent on the ending you choose with Lord Shimura. The white righteous punishment if you kill him, or the red vow of vengeance if you spare him. You'll also find him doing something different in the shack depending on your choice, either resting if you killed him or kneeling at a table writing if you spared him. The time of day may also be different, being nighttime for the former and daytime for the latter, though that could honestly just be my game. Either way, we're free to explore our given shack with many different items from across the main story scattered around the place that we can interact with Jin saying something with regards to said item. Most of them will be the same between the two decisions, though certain items will be different, for obvious reasons. Once we step outside our new home, we'll be greeted by Yuna, who will comment on your decision, either offering her condolences or asking if Lord Shimura will go after them. Her and Jin will then agree to split up and go their separate ways, hopefully only temporarily, to continue the fight against the Mongols. Khoten Khan may be dead, but his forces are still ever present on Tsushima and will be more desperate than ever to conquer the island. From there, we'll return to the open world, where we're free to pursue any side quests and content not yet finished. That said, with this and Yuna's departure, so ends the story of Ghost of Tsushima. The story of Ghost of Tsushima is a brilliant tale, one that I will remember fondly for years to come. In a year full of gargantuan releases, quite a few of which were equally praised for their narratives, Sucker Punch managed to put together their own compelling, emotionally gripping narrative, one that, even 4 years later, is still being talked about, to the point where it's getting its own film adaptation. This is thanks to the excellent writing, not just in the narrative, but also in the characters in the island of Tsushima itself. In fact, so well received was Sucker Punch's depiction of Tsushima that directors Nate Fox and Jason Connell were named tourism ambassadors to Tsushima Island in 2021. Despite the issues that plague some of the writing and the presentation, Sucker Punch have created for themselves an excellent foundation to carry Jin's story forward. If there is indeed going to be a sequel, it will very quickly become one of my most anticipated games when it's announced, for I cannot wait to see where they take Jin's story from here. Sucker Punch already struck gold with the open world samurai setting, a setting that many gamers have been asking for years, then smashed it out of the park with the wonderful narrative they made for it. To that, I raise a cup of sake to them and say, well done, and thank you.